In the late 1980s, Europe remained a continent divided by rival ideologies. An Iron Curtain, both metaphorical and literal, split east from west, nowhere more tangibly than in Berlin, where a wall of concrete and barbed wire snaked through the city's heart. For 28 years, the Berlin Wall stood as a relic of a bygone era, a stark emblem of the Cold War's unnatural division of Europe. Armed East German border guards had orders to shoot anyone attempting to escape to the west, underscoring the harsh reality of life behind the wall. Families, friends, and neighbors were separated by this barrier of stone and suspicion. Yet even in those dark years, the people of Berlin kept alive a precious fire of freedom, a hope that one day the division would be healed. That hope was rewarded on the night of November 9th, 1989. On that historic evening, crowds gathered at border checkpoints in Berlin amid rumors that travel restrictions would be lifted. In an atmosphere of disbelief and elation, East Germans poured through the gates that had so long confined them. The moment a border guard hesitantly raised a barrier, an irrepressible flood of people surged across. Strangers fell into each other's arms, laughing and weeping. Celebrations erupted in the city's streets as decades of pent-up yearning for unity burst forth. Jubilant revelers climbed atop the wall itself, singing, dancing, and toasting newfound freedom under the cold autumn sky. Many brought hammers and chisels, joining in a spontaneous frenzy to chip away pieces of the wall. These ordinary Berliners turned activists earned the nickname Mauerspechte, or wall woodpeckers, as they tapped at the concrete to collect mementos of tyranny's end. Within days, large sections of the hated barrier had been reduced to rubble. This joyful dismantling of the Berlin Wall was rich in symbolic and political significance. For 2 generations, the wall had been the physical representation of the Iron Curtain, the front line of the Cold War. Its fall, almost overnight, came to represent nothing less than the end of the Cold War itself. Televised images of Germans from east and west embracing atop the graffiti-covered wall sent a wave of optimism around the globe. In Washington, U.S. President George H.W. Bush watched the scenes unfold live on television, aware of the profound historical significance of the moment. Not even the most optimistic onlooker, he reflected, could have imagined such scenes just a few years earlier. After all, it was only in 1987 that President Ronald Reagan stood before the Brandenburg Gate and implored, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," a bold challenge that seemed aspirational at the time. Now, in 1989, the seemingly impossible was happening. The wall was coming down peacefully at the hands of the people themselves. That peaceful triumph was not predestined. It was the result of courage, change, and restraint. In decades, past similar uprisings in Eastern Europe had met brutal Soviet repression. Tanks had rolled against protesters in East Berlin in 1953, Budapest in 1956, and Prague in 1968. But by the late 1980s, the climate was different. A reform-minded Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, had signaled an end to the Brezhnev Doctrine, which had asserted Moscow's right to intervene militarily in its satellite states. Gorbachev's policies of perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, openness, encouraged calls for reform throughout the Eastern Bloc. Crucially, Gorbachev made it clear that the Soviet Union would no longer prop up hardline communist regimes by force. This new Sinatra doctrine jocularly named for the song My Way, since each nation could now go its own way, emboldened peoples from Poland to Bulgaria to take their destiny into their own hands. As one Soviet official later wrote in his diary on November 10th, 1989, the fall of the wall marked a shift in the world balance of forces, the definitive end of the post-war division agreed at Yalta decades earlier. And so, the Cold War twilight gave way to a new dawn. The opening of the Berlin Wall was the first of many tumblers to click into place, unlocking the shackles that had bound Eastern Europe. A continent long split between rival spheres of influence now faced the exhilarating, if dawning, prospect of reuniting. In the gentle glow of that November night and the days that followed, as Berliners walked freely through gaps in the wall's scarred masonry, an old era was fading and a new one being born. The wall had fallen, and with it fell the barriers, physical and psychological, that had kept Europe divided. A calm stillness followed the initial celebrations, as though the continent collectively exhaled decades of tension. In that stillness lay a hopeful question: what comes next? What follows is a chronologically guided, yet thematically rich exploration of Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall. In a serene, atmospheric narrative style, gentle and reflective, we will travel through the transformative events that reshaped Europe from 1989 onward. We will witness the reunification of Germany and the profound political, social, and economic changes it brought. We will observe how the Eastern Bloc dissolved and the mighty Soviet Union itself disintegrated, sending shockwaves through global geopolitics. We will trace the difficult transition from centrally planned economies to market systems and the parallel push for democratic reforms amid both triumphs and setbacks. Our journey will chart the expansion of the European Union and the remaking of Europe's security frameworks, including the enlargement of NATO. We will also reflect on the cultural renaissance in post-communist societies, the renewal of art, education, and open discourse once stifled by censorship. The human dimension features prominently the flows of migration, the search for identity, and the ways Europeans, East and West, have grappled with the legacy of Cold War divisions. Finally, we will contemplate the passage of time, how integration, memory, and generational change have shaped today's Europe more than 3 decades after that jubilant night in Berlin. Throughout this narrative, the tone will remain gentle and engaging. The aim is to inform, but also to soothe, offering history in a calm voice suitable for late-night reflection. Let us begin by setting the stage in 1989, the year of miracles that saw the Cold War's peaceful conclusion, and then proceed to explore how Europe rebuilt itself after the wall, rediscovering unity, freedom, and the challenges of a new era. German reunification, a nation and a continent reunited. The fall of the Berlin Wall paved the way for something that many Germans had long dreamed of but hardly dared believe possible: the reunification of East and West Germany into a single, sovereign nation. In November 1989, as people danced atop the wall and chipped away at its concrete, Chancellor Helmut Kohl sensed history moving quickly. He famously announced a bold 10-point plan for German reunification before the year's end. What had once been a distant vision, Deutschland einig Vaterland, a unified fatherland, suddenly seemed within reach. Yet the path to reunification was uncharted and delicate, requiring statesmanship of the highest order. Kohl and his contemporaries had to manage not only the merging of two very different German states, but also the anxieties and hopes of international powers who watched a rising Germany warily. Politically, reunification moved at a breathtaking pace. In early 1990, East Germany, formerly the German Democratic Republic, GDR, held its first free elections. Voters overwhelmingly supported parties favoring quick unification with the West. By July 1990, a monetary and economic union was established. The West German Deutsche Mark became the currency of the East, binding the two economies. Then, on October 3, 1990, Germany was officially reunified. The black-red-gold flag of the Federal Republic was raised across the former East, and Berlin was declared the restored capital of one Germany. After 45 years of post-war division, Germany was whole again, a moment of profound joy for millions. Church bells rang out across the country that day, and spontaneous celebrations filled city squares despite drizzling autumn rain. Families long separated by barbed wire and death strips could now reunite freely. As one East German remarked on that day, "We are one people again," encapsulating the simple yet extraordinary fact of reunification. However, this national reunion brought immense challenges. Socially and economically, East and West Germany were worlds apart after 4 decades on different paths. West Germany in 1990 was a prosperous capitalist democracy, the engine of the European community, while East Germany's socialist economy was on the brink of collapse. When the two merged, the disparities became glaring. Factories in the East, once sheltered by central planning, suddenly had to compete in the free market and proved woefully uncompetitive. By the end of 1990, industrial output in the Eastern Länder states plummeted and many factories closed their doors. Unemployment in the East surged to levels unseen in living memory as inefficient state enterprises folded. Entire industries, textiles, shipbuilding, machine tools, struggled or vanished in the face of Western competition. Within a couple of years, Eastern Germany's industrial output had fallen by roughly 2/3, a drastic contraction that brought social pain. Workers who had once been assured a job by the socialist state now faced joblessness and uncertainty. Towns built around single big factories, a coal mine, a steel mill, were hit especially hard when those enterprises downsized or shut down. The human impact of these changes was enormous. While Western Germans, Wesses, welcomed their Eastern compatriots, Osses, with hope, misunderstandings, and cultural differences soon surfaced. East Germans often felt like second-class citizens in the new Germany, grappling with the shock of rapid change. West Germans sometimes struggled to understand the East's trauma and the nostalgia some Osses felt for certain aspects of their old life, a phenomenon dubbed Ostalgie, nostalgia for the East. Despite living under a repressive regime, many East Germans had enjoyed tight-knit community life and cradle-to-grave social guarantees like employment and housing. In the new capitalist Germany, those guarantees evaporated. An East German factory worker, suddenly unemployed in 1991, described it as, like the floor was pulled out from under our feet, though he still believed reunification was the right thing inevitably. The West German government, under Kohl's leadership, poured massive funds into the East, billions of marks each year, to prevent complete economic collapse and to start rebuilding the infrastructure and industries. Roads were repaved, telephone lines modernized, and ancient buildings received facelifts in eastern cities that had seen little investment under communism. Despite these efforts, the East-West gap remained evident. Even 3 decades on, Germans widely acknowledged that the former East still lagged behind the West in standard of living. Internationally, German reunification had to overcome diplomatic hurdles and deep historical fears. The specter of a large, powerful Germany in the center of Europe stirred anxieties in London, Paris, and Moscow. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, dubbed the Iron Lady, was openly skeptical and privately hostile to the idea of German unity. "We beat the Germans twice, and now they're back," Thatcher reportedly quipped in late 1989, stunning other European leaders with her candor. She worried that a reunified Germany might dominate Europe or drift away from Western alliances. French President François Mitterrand, while less blunt, also harbored reservations. In a January 1990 conversation, Mitterrand warned Thatcher that reunification could give Germany more European influence than Hitler ever had, even musing darkly about the return of bad Germans if unity went wrong. These remarks, born of 20th century trauma, revealed the trust that Germany still had to earn from its neighbors. At the same time, Soviet leader Gorbachev, whose country had lost 27 million people fighting Nazi Germany, initially balked at the idea of a reunified Germany within NATO. Here, deft diplomacy was essential. Helmut Kohl, supported by U.S. President Bush, engaged in intensive negotiations with all concerned powers, the 2+4 talks, involving the 2 German states and the 4 WHUIT allies. In the end, Gorbachev agreed to let a united Germany choose its alliances freely, a monumental concession. The Soviets received assurances that NATO would not station nuclear weapons in former East Germany, and Germany in turn pledged peaceful intentions. Substantial financial aid on the order of 100 billion marks was provided to facilitate the withdrawal of the massive Soviet military presence from East Germany. By late 1994, the last Russian troops departed German soil peacefully, an outcome scarcely imaginable a few years prior. See, with diplomatic ties smoothed and treaties signed, Germany's reunification proceeded and became an anchor for broader European unity. On October 3, 1990, now celebrated every year as the Day of German Unity, the world witnessed the peaceful emergence of a reunified Germany firmly anchored in democracy and the Western Alliance. Former adversaries embraced the new reality. "A Europe whole and free is within our reach tonight," declared U.S. President Bush as the German flag was raised over the restored Reichstag building in Berlin. Indeed, many saw German reunification as the capstone on the Cold War's end, a powerful symbol that Europe's divisions could be healed. For Germans themselves, the process of inner unity, innere Einheit, was just beginning. Enormous financial transfers, sometimes likened to a solidarity sacrifice by West Germans, flowed eastward to uplift the struggling Eastern economy. Over time, these efforts bore fruit. Decaying city centers in places like Dresden and Leipzig were beautifully restored. Autobahns and railways were upgraded, knitting the country together. New enterprises and startups sprouted in the East, often aided by outside investment. By the early 2000s, glossy office buildings and shopping malls had risen where communist-era concrete blocks once stood. A new generation of Eastern German youth came of age with opportunities their parents could scarcely have imagined, studying in Western universities, starting businesses, traveling freely abroad. Yet the human stories of reunification were often bittersweet. Many East Germans had to reinvent their lives and identities in their middle age. Former teachers, engineers, and civil servants often found their qualifications didn't match the requirements of the new system, forcing career changes. Some former factory workers took retraining courses in entirely new fields. There were tales of personal heartbreak, as when a proud, skilled machinist from Chemnitz, formerly Karl Marx Stadt, lost his job and said, "I feel like I've become useless overnight." There were also heartwarming tales, such as families divided since the 1960s, finally able to celebrate holidays together without visas or checkpoint. Drama. Western and Eastern Germans gradually learned from one another. West Germans began to better appreciate the resilience and resourcefulness it took to live under a dictatorship. Easterners, in turn, embraced democratic habits, voter participation, civic activism that had been denied to them. Over time, regional stereotypes started to soften. By the late 1990s, intermarriage between Ossis and Wessis was increasingly common, and a shared German national identity resurged among the young. Reunification also had a profound psychological effect on Europe as a whole. A divided Germany had been a cornerstone of the post-Woiwurritude order. Its very existence had symbolized East-West confrontation. Now, a united and democratic Germany became a driving force for European integration. Helmut Kohl memorably assured his wary neighbors that German unity and European unity were two sides of the same coin. He pushed for deeper ties within the European community, soon to become the European Union, partly to reassure Europe that a bigger Germany would not act alone. True to Kohl's vision, reunified Germany devoted itself to the project of a more integrated Europe, supporting the creation of the euro currency and the enlargement of the EU to include its Eastern European neighbors. In this way, Germany's unification acted as a catalyst for the wider reunification of Europe. 3 decades later, Germans overwhelmingly agree that reunification was a good thing for the country. The initial hardships, though significant, have gradually given way to a more balanced prosperity. By the 2020s, the former East's economy had grown considerably, and cities like Berlin, Dresden, and Rostock became vibrant hubs of culture and commerce. Nevertheless, echoes of the past linger. Surveys show that only about 30% of Germans believe the East has achieved fully equal living standards with the West, a testament to the long shadow of division. The Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle, that lifted West Germany after Woiwurritude did not repeat overnight in the East. Progress has been steady but incomplete, and in the collective memory, the experiences of reunification remain mixed. Pride in the peaceful overcoming of tyranny, tempered by the memory of social dislocation and the loss of familiar structures. In summary, the reunification of Germany between 1989 and 1990 was a momentous event that reshaped Europe's landscape. It brought joy and hope, along with economic challenges and social adjustments. Germany's coming back together not only healed a nation divided by war and ideology, but also accelerated the momentum for a continent coming back together. As we continue our journey, the ripple effects of German reunification will be felt in many of the themes that follow, from the collapse of communism, across Eastern Europe to the expansion of European institutions. The German story was but the first chapter in the larger saga of Europe's transformation after the fall of the Wall. The dissolution of the Eastern Bloc. Revolutions of 1989. Even as Germany hurtled toward unity, a wave of revolutions swept through Eastern Europe in 1989, toppling one communist regime after another in what has been called the Autumn of Nations, or the Year of Miracles. For decades, the countries of the Eastern Bloc, from Poland and Czechoslovakia to Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and beyond, had been ruled by authoritarian communist parties aligned with the Soviet Union. By the late 1980s, however, the old order was cracking. Economic stagnation, public discontent, and the inspiriting effect of reforms in Moscow ignited popular movements demanding change. In an astonishingly short span, one country after another in Eastern Europe broke free of communist rule, largely through peaceful uprisings. The Berlin Wall's breach was one dramatic peak of this wave, but similar transformations were happening across the region, each with its own character and heroes. The chain of events began fittingly in Poland, a nation with a deep history of resistance to Soviet domination. As early as the summer of 1980, Polish shipyard workers, led by an electrician named Lech Wałęsa, had formed an independent trade union called Solidarity, which rapidly grew into a broad anti-communist social movement. After years of underground struggle, including a harsh period of martial law in the early 1980s, Solidarity re-emerged in 1989 to negotiate with Poland's beleaguered communist government. In April 1989, the regime agreed to semi-free elections, a small opening that led to a landslide victory for Solidarity candidates in June. On June 4, 1989, the very same day that Chinese authorities brutally crushed protests in Tiananmen Square, Poles flocked to polling stations and voted overwhelmingly for Solidarity, repudiating communist candidates, even for seats where only partial competition was allowed. The result was staggering. Within weeks, Poland had its first non-communist prime minister in the Eastern Bloc, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, sworn in by late August 1989. The Polish election was a triggering spark for the region. It demonstrated that communist regimes, once thought immovable, could be swept aside by popular will if given a chance. Next came Hungary, which by 1989 was already implementing cautious reforms from within. The Hungarian communist leadership, among the most pragmatic in Eastern Europe, decided to get ahead of the curve. In early 1989, Hungary's government opened its border with Austria, effectively creating the first breach in the Iron Curtain. All that summer, East German tourists vacationing at Lake Balaton in Hungary took advantage of the open border to flee to the west, with tens of thousands escaping through Hungary into Austria. Rather than shoot these escapees, Hungarian border guards stood aside, a humane decision that quietly undercut the Eastern Bloc's division. Meanwhile, Hungary's own citizens were pushing for change. In June 1989, Hungarians held a public reburial ceremony for Imre Nagy, the reformist leader executed after the 1956 uprising, a powerful symbolic repudiation of past repression. By October 1989, the Hungarian Communist Party had reinvented itself as a democratic socialist party, and the country officially shed one-party rule. It adopted a new constitution, allowing multi-party elections, which would be held in the spring of 1990. Thus, Hungary transformed itself without a street revolution through a negotiated transition, often called the system change, rendszerváltás in Hungarian. Hungarian reformers joked that they had achieved their revolution by round table rather than guillotine, emphasizing the negotiated, non-violent character of their transition. The tremors from Warsaw and Budapest reached East Germany, the GDR, by the autumn of 1989, setting the stage for the wall's fall, as described earlier. But East Germany's upheaval was just one part of the regional earthquake. To the south, in Czechoslovakia, the winds of change gathered into what became known as the Velvet Revolution. Velvet, because of its remarkable smoothness and non-violence. In early November 1989, inspired by events in Berlin and the general liberalization around them, Czech and Slovak students took to the streets of Prague demanding freedom. On November 17, 1989, a peaceful student demonstration in Prague was violently broken up by riot police, an incident that outraged the public. In the days that followed, hundreds of thousands of citizens flooded Prague's central plazas, Wenceslas Square and Letná Plain, carrying candles, jingling keys, a sign of saying goodbye to the regime, and chanting for change. The communist leadership, paralyzed and increasingly isolated, capitulated in the face of this popular tsunami. By late November, they announced they would relinquish their monopoly on power. The dissident playwright Václav Havel, who had spent years in prison for opposing the regime, became the face of the revolution. On December 29, 1989, in a dramatic turn of history, Havel was elected president of Czechoslovakia in the very castle in Prague where communist rulers had signed his arrest warrants. In just 6 weeks, Czechoslovakia went from a Stalinist-style regime to a budding democracy led by former dissidents. The sheer speed and peacefulness of the Velvet Revolution astonished the world. One Czech student leader compared it to a fairy tale unfolding. So implausible did it seem that a totalitarian regime could vanish without a fight. The name Velvet captured the soft, gentle nature of this transformation. No shots fired, no windows broken, just civic determination and moral courage forcing a bloodless handover of power. In neighboring Bulgaria, change also arrived in 1989, albeit more quietly. The long-serving communist strongman, Todor Zhivkov, had been in power for 35 years. But with Moscow's new stance and unrest simmering, even his colleagues sensed it was time for him to go. On November 10, 1989, one day after the Berlin Wall fell, the Bulgarian Communist Party's Central Committee convened in Sofia and unceremoniously ousted Zhivkov in an internal coup. They replaced him with a younger, reform-minded communist, Petr Mladenov. This palace coup was intended to siphon off popular pressure, and indeed Bulgaria's transition was more controlled from the top compared to others. Still, it opened the door for reforms. The new leadership legalized opposition groups and announced free elections for 1990. As winter set in, Bulgarians held public rallies, including environmental protests that had been an outlet for dissent, now turning explicitly political. The once unthinkable became normal. People openly criticized the Communist Party in streets and squares. Though the ex-communists would manage to win the first election in 1990, helped by their enduring networks, the genie of freedom was out of the bottle in Bulgaria as well. Romania was the exception to the peaceful pattern. There, the end of 1989 was drenched in blood and drama as the continent's most repressive dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu, fought desperately to hold power. Ceausescu had ruled Romania with an iron grip and a cult of personality for nearly a quarter century, brooking no dissent. While other Eastern European leaders cautiously opened to reforms or resigned, Ceausescu denounced the changes around him as foreign plots. But by December 1989, even in Romania, the anger was boiling over. It began in the city of Timișoara, where on December 17th, security forces fired on crowds protesting the government's attempt to evict a dissident ethnic Hungarian pastor. Dozens of unarmed protesters were shot dead, an act of brutality that triggered national outrage. As news of the Timișoara massacre spread, despite official attempts to suppress it, protests ignited in other cities. On December 21st, Ceausescu convened a mass rally in Bucharest, presumably to demonstrate support. Instead, the crowd heckled him on live television, a stunning public rejection. Chaos ensued. The next day, December 22nd, the dictator and his wife Elena fled the capital by helicopter as the army and even members of his inner circle turned against him. They were captured attempting to escape. In a hasty and dramatic denouement on Christmas Day 1989, Ceausescu and his wife were tried by a military tribunal, convicted of genocide and other crimes, and executed by firing squad. Their deaths marked the violent full stop to Romania's revolution. In just a week's time, Romania had gone from totalitarian nightmare to chaotic freedom at the cost of over 1,000 lives lost in street battles and crackdowns. The images of young Romanians waving tricolor flags with the communist emblem cut out of the center became emblematic of their revolution. Though freedom had dawned, it was accompanied by grief and turmoil. In the aftermath, a group of former communist officials, led by Ion Iliescu, took provisional power, vowing to establish democracy, but Romania's path would remain bumpy and contested, haunted by the specter of its violent birth into freedom. By the summer of 1990, every Eastern European country, once behind the Iron Curtain, had broken away from communist rule. It was a nearly unfathomable reversal of fortune, a geopolitical earthquake. A region that for decades had been locked into the Warsaw Pact, and Comecon, the Soviet-led economic bloc, was now composed of fledgling democracies seeking to return to Europe. In many of these countries, democratic elections brought new leaders to power, often former dissidents, intellectuals, or reform communists turned Democrats. In Poland, Lech Wałęsa would become president by the end of 1990. In Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel took the helm of state. In Hungary, a free election in early 1990 installed a center-right government. Even in countries where former communist parties managed to win elections, as in Bulgaria and partially Romania, they had to operate in a pluralist system and soon evolved into more conventional social democratic parties. The speed of these changes, though, left both citizens and international observers in awe. Dominoes were falling, as one account put it, but unlike the feared domino theory of old, the spread of communism, those were dominoes of liberation falling one after another. Critical to the success of these revolutions was the fact that the Soviet Union, under Gorbachev's restraint, did not intervene militarily. The Red Army divisions stationed across Eastern Europe stayed in their barracks throughout 1989. This non-interference was decisive. In previous decades, the mere threat of Soviet tanks had kept a lid on Eastern Europeans' aspirations. Now, with that threat removed, the peoples of the Eastern Bloc seized their moment with remarkable courage and unity. They formed human chains, as in the Baltic Way of August 1989, when millions in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined hands across 600 kilometers to demand independence. They organized round-table talks and massive street demonstrations. They kept largely to peaceful methods, rallies, strikes, symbolic acts like tearing down statues of Stalin. Aside from Romania, the revolutions were largely nonviolent, earning the descriptor peaceful revolution, especially in the German context, Die Friedliche Revolution. This peaceful character lent a hopeful, almost euphoric atmosphere to the end of 1989. However, it's important to note that the collapse of communism also brought uncertainty. As each regime fell, there were immediate questions. Who would lead the new governments? How would the economy be stabilized? Would ethnic tensions, long suppressed by authoritarian rule, resurface? In multinational states like the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, the weakening of central authority did indeed open the door to nationalist movements, as we will see in coming sections. But in Central and Eastern Europe, the story of 1989 to 90 remained largely one of jubilation and relief. A popular Czech slogan in those days was "Zpátky do Evropy," back to Europe, reflecting the feeling that these nations were rejoining the cultural and political mainstream from which they had been forcibly separated after World War II. By mid-1990, with free elections held and new governments in place across the region, the Eastern Bloc had effectively dissolved. The Warsaw Pact, the military alliance that once bound the USSR and its satellites, formally disbanded in early 1991. The Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, CUMCON, the Communist Trading Bloc, also dissolved. Eastern European countries began establishing independent foreign policies and opening their economies to the world. Many removed the word socialist from their official country names. Statues of Lenin and Marx were taken down or relocated to museums. Street names were changed from communist heroes to national or historical figures. It was an era of rapid symbolic change, as if whole societies were undergoing a deep spring cleaning of the old ideological order. Through it all, a sense of shared experience emerged among these nations. They had different languages and histories, but in 1989 they spoke a common political language of freedom. Leaders from these new democracies met frequently, encouraging one another and discussing common futures. The idea of a return to Europe implied not just shedding communism, but also aspiring to join institutions like the European Community, later the EU, and NATO, aspirations that, while not immediately fulfilled, would guide their policies in the coming years. One eloquent contemporary observer of these events was Anatoly Chernyayev, Gorbachev's foreign policy advisor. Writing in his diary as the Berlin Wall fell, he noted that it symbolized nothing less than the end of Yalta, meaning the end of the post-Ukraine order that had divided Europe into spheres of influence. He called it a shift in the world's balance of forces, recognizing that the Cold War's zero-sum calculus was giving way to something new and as yet undefined. In December 1989, U.S. President Bush and Gorbachev met on a ship off the coast of Malta and together declared the Cold War over, even using the poetic phrase that they had buried the Cold War at the bottom of the Mediterranean. The world, and especially Europe, was waking up to a fundamentally changed reality. As 1990 dawned, Eastern Europe's peoples faced the exhilarating task of building new societies on the ruins of the old. Democracy, pluralism, and open markets, concepts long suppressed, were now the guiding stars, albeit ones easier proclaimed than achieved. There was a palpable sense of optimism, a belief that the hardships of the past could be overcome through solidarity and effort. A Polish journalist in early 1990 wrote, "We are standing in the rubble of an old house, but the plans for a new one are in our hands, and the sun is shining." That captured the mix of ruin and hope across the region. Before moving on, let us pause to appreciate the magnitude of what happened in 1989. In the span of a few months, millions of people in Eastern Europe reclaimed their freedom. The Berlin Wall fell, dictators were deposed, dissidents became presidents, and notably, apart from Romania's bloodshed, it was largely achieved without pitched battles, a testament to the power of collective, peaceful action. These revolutions of 1989 set the stage for everything that followed in Europe. They were the prerequisite for German reunification, for the expansion of the European Union, for the strategic realignments in security, and indeed for the very notion of a Europe whole and free. As we shall see, the collapse of the Eastern Bloc was followed swiftly by the even more dramatic dissolution of the Soviet Union itself, the empire at the center of the communist world. We turn now to that momentous event, which unfolded in 1991 and marked the definitive end of the Cold War era. The collapse of the Soviet Union, 1991. The disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991 was an epochal event that transformed the political map of the world. What had been the vast, nuclear-armed superpower at the heart of the Cold War simply ceased to exist, virtually without violence, over the course of a few bewildering months. For over 70 years, the Soviet Union, the USSR, had stood as a colossus, a multinational empire of 15 republics ranging from Europe across Asia. Its collapse marked the final denouement of the Cold War and gave birth to a host of independent nations, dramatically altering Europe's eastern half. This process was complex, and unlike the Eastern European revolutions, largely driven by internal dynamics within the Soviet Union, although the two were interconnected. By 1990, cracks in the Soviet Union's foundations were growing. Mikhail Gorbachev's reform policies, begun in the mid-1980s, unintentionally loosened the tightly wound springs of the Soviet system. Glasnost, openness, allowed unprecedented public criticism of the government and airing of grievances, while perestroika, restructuring, attempted to modernize the stagnant command economy. These reforms created as many problems as they tried to solve. Economic output faltered, shortages worsened in some areas, and long-suppressed ethnic and nationalist tensions bubbled to the surface. The Baltic republics of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia led the way in asserting their rights. They had been independent countries before World War II and were forcibly incorporated into the USSR in 1940, an act never recognized by the West. In 1989, amidst the general liberalization, the Baltic peoples pressed hard for independence. Mass demonstrations, like the Baltic Way human chain, showed their unity of purpose. In early 1990, Lithuania boldly declared restoration of independence. Gorbachev's central government, alarmed, deemed it illegal and at one point sent troops, leading to a tense standoff. Meanwhile, Russia itself, the core of the Soviet Union, saw the rise of a political maverick, Boris Yeltsin, a one-time Gorbachev ally turned rival. In June 1991, in a newly created post, Yeltsin was elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, Russia within the USSR, by popular vote. This was a seismic shift. For the first time, the Russian Republic had an elected leader and one with a mandate distinct from Gorbachev's. Yeltsin championed radical economic reform and more autonomy for Russia, even as Gorbachev tried to hold the Union together through a new treaty. The breaking point came in August 1991. Hardline communist officials and military officers, opposed to Gorbachev's reforms and fearing the imminent signing of a new Union treaty that would decentralize power to the republics, launched an attempted coup d'etat. On August 19, 1991, they seized control of Moscow, put Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation dacha in Crimea, and declared a state of emergency. Tanks rolled into Moscow's streets, raising the specter of a crackdown. But things did not go as the plotters planned. Ordinary Muscovites, in an act of bravery, poured into the streets to resist the coup, building barricades and confronting the military with appeals not to shoot. Boris Yeltsin famously climbed atop a tank outside the Russian White House, Parliament building, rallying the crowd and denouncing the coup as illegal. His defiant image on the tank, waving the Russian tricolor flag, became an icon of the Soviet people's yearning for change. Crucially, the coup attempt lacked resolve and failed to garner support from key military units. Within 3 tense days, the hardliners' coup collapsed. Gorbachev was freed and returned to Moscow, but the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. Yeltsin emerged as the popular hero of the hour, while the Communist Party's authority was fatally undermined. In the aftermath, Yeltsin's government banned the Communist Party in Russia, at least temporarily, and seized its assets, something unimaginable just months before. The failed August coup acted as the death knell of the Soviet Union. In the coup's wake, republic after republic declared independence, unwilling to remain under the Kremlin's faltering grip. Ukraine, the second most populous republic after Russia, held a referendum in December 1991, in which an overwhelming majority voted for independence. By that time, the Soviet Union's dissolution was effectively a foregone conclusion. On December 8, 1991, leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, the 3 Slavic republics that were founding members of the USSR in 1922, met secretly in a hunting lodge in the Belovezha forest in Belarus. There, Yeltsin, Russia, Leonid Kravchuk, Ukraine, and Stanislav Shushkevich, Belarus, signed an agreement declaring that the Soviet Union was dissolved and would be replaced by a loose Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. They pointedly did not invite Gorbachev. When news of this pact broke, it was effectively the end. Later in December, 8 other republics joined the CIS initiative. Gorbachev, finding himself leader of a country that had ceased to exist, had little choice but to acquiesce. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union, a position that now had no meaning, and the red Soviet flag with hammer and sickle was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, replaced by the Russian Federation's tricolor flag. The Soviet Union, which had been composed of 15 republics, was now gone. In its place, stood 15 independent countries. Russia was the largest and assumed the USSR's UN seat and mantle, but it no longer ruled the others. From the Baltic Sea, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, to Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, etc., new nations began their independent trajectories. This astonishingly peaceful breakup, peaceful in the sense of no large-scale war between the Soviet center and the republics, though violence did occur in some places like the Baltics and Caucasus, amazed the world. People who had grown up pledging allegiance to the Soviet flag now found that flag in museums and history books. In Moscow and other cities, statues of Lenin were quietly removed or relocated in the months that followed as the new Russia sought to turn a page. The year 1992 began with Russia and the other former Soviet republics charting uncertain courses forward as separate states. For Eastern Europe and the world, the collapse of the Soviet Union had far-reaching implications. It decisively ended the Cold War's bipolar division. Suddenly, there was no more Soviet bloc. Countries that had been constrained by the U.S.-Soviet rivalry could now pursue independent alignments. For Eastern European nations, it removed any lingering possibility of a Soviet reversal of 1989. The Soviet yoke, as one Hungarian official termed it, was truly gone. Former satellite states no longer had to worry about a comeback by Moscow's empire. The disappearance of the USSR also meant the end of the Warsaw Pact, which had formally disbanded earlier in 1991, and the lifting of the Iron Curtain's geopolitical rationale. Western institutions like NATO and the European Community suddenly faced the challenge and opportunity of redefining their roles in a post-Soviet unipolar world. Within the territory of the ex-USSR, huge transitions loomed. Russia itself had to remake its political and economic system essentially from scratch, moving from communism to capitalism and autocracy to democracy simultaneously. It was a Herculean task that would dominate the 1990s and often plunge Russia into turmoil. More on that in the next section on economic transition. Other newly independent states had their unique situations. The Baltic states swiftly reoriented westward, seeking integration with Europe. Ukraine grappled with its identity separate from Russia. Belarus, under its first post-Soviet leader, edged toward a more authoritarian path. The Caucasus republics, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, faced ethnic conflicts and instability. Moldova, at Europe's edge, navigated relations with Romania and a secessionist conflict in Transnistria. Central Asia's republics adjusted to independence, with old communist elites still in power, now as national presidents. For the focus of our narrative, Europe after the wall, the main immediate effect was that by the end of 1991, the Cold War was truly over. There was no more Soviet Union, and thus the bipolar contest in Europe ended conclusively. It ushered in what some called a new world order, one initially characterized by U.S. and Western primacy in the hope of spreading liberal democracy. In Europe, thoughts quickly turned to how to anchor the newly free countries, both those formerly in the Eastern Bloc and those emerging from the USSR, into stable, cooperative structures. This period gave birth to terms like Euro-Atlantic integration, reflecting efforts to bring these countries into institutions like the European Community, which became the European Union and NATO. But before those integration dreams could be realized, the former communist states first had to navigate the treacherous waters of economic and political transition in the early 1990s. In sum, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a peaceful geopolitical revolution of staggering scale. On December 31st, 1991, people across Europe and the world greeted the new year with both celebration and uncertainty. An era had ended, and the map had been rewritten. In Europe, no Russian tanks stood on foreign soil for the first time in half a century. The Red Army retreated from Central and Eastern Europe, and former communist countries looked eagerly westward for partnerships and models. One poignant scene marked the finale of the Soviet Union's story. On that Christmas Day in 1991, when Gorbachev resigned, he delivered a televised farewell address acknowledging the end of the Soviet era and expressing hope for the future. Viewers around the world watched in amazement as the red Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. A CNN broadcaster famously commented, "For the first time in over 70 years, there is no hammer and sickle flying over Red Square." It was a moment at once melancholy and hopeful, melancholy for those who mourned the lost certainties and superpower status, hopeful for those who anticipated a freer, more peaceful chapter of history. With the Soviet collapse, Europe's post-Cold War transformation entered a new phase. There was no longer a clear East versus West divide dictated by superpower blocs. Instead, the landscape was more fluid, new democracies striving to implement reforms and join Western institutions, Russia and other ex-Soviet states finding their footing, and the Western European countries adjusting to a continent suddenly much larger and more complex. The next great challenge was turning the revolutionary gains of 1989 to 91 into lasting, stable systems, to take societies long molded by central planning and authoritarianism and guide them toward open markets and open politics. We turn now to that immense challenge, the transition from centrally planned economies to market economies, and the concurrent efforts to build functioning democracies across the former communist world. It was a journey fraught with pain and difficulty, but one that ultimately aimed to secure the freedom that 1989 had won. From plan to market, economic transition in Eastern Europe. The early 1990s in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union were a time of profound economic upheaval. The challenge was unprecedented in scale. Entire nations had to transition from centrally planned economies to market-based systems virtually overnight. Under communism, prices had been set by the state. Production was guided by 5-year plans rather than consumer demand, and private enterprise was mostly non-existent. Now, these countries sought to build capitalism on the ruins of socialism. Factories had to be privatized, prices liberalized, and new institutions, like stock markets, commercial banks, and property laws, created from scratch. The process was often chaotic and painful, a trial by fire for millions of ordinary people whose daily lives were turned upside down by inflation, layoffs, and sudden new freedoms in the marketplace. An oft-quoted metaphor captured the difficulty of this task. Anyone can turn an aquarium into fish stew, but turning fish stew back into an aquarium is much harder. This wry observation by a Russian commentator highlighted how easy it had been to destroy the old market systems and replace them with communist fish stew, and how daunting it was now to recreate a living, functioning market ecosystem. The communist economic inheritance was indeed like a bowl of stew, everything mixed together. State ownership of nearly all enterprises distorted prices that bore little relation to real value, and an entrenched bureaucracy used to commanding rather than facilitating economic activity. To build a healthy aquarium, a market economy, out of that stew would require dramatic measures. Different countries chose different approaches, but broadly, two strategies emerged: shock therapy and more gradual reform. In Poland, which was at the forefront of change again, the first post-communist government, led by Mazowiecki and Finance Minister Leszek Balcerowicz, opted for shock therapy. On January 1st, 1990, Poland implemented a radical stabilization program. Prices were freed in one go, ending decades of subsidies and controls. The currency was devalued and made convertible, and strict budget discipline was imposed. This led to an initial shock. Prices skyrocketed. Poles saw shelves go from empty to full, but at prices many times higher than before. Inflation in early 1990 soared, but within a year it began to stabilize. The rationale was that only a sharp break could end the vicious cycle of shortages and hyperinflation that communist mismanagement had created. Poland's economy indeed hit a steep downturn in 1990. Output fell, unemployment spiked, but by 1992 it was growing again. In fact, Poland became one of the success stories, being the first in the region to regain its pre-1989 GDP and continuing to grow thereafter. Czechoslovakia, which would split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia in 1993, also adopted a rapid reform strategy under Finance Minister Václav Klaus. Prices were freed, and a mass privatization program was launched via vouchers distributed to citizens, allowing them to buy stakes in former state enterprises. The Czechs experienced a rough adjustment too, but were bolstered by a relatively more industrialized economy and proximity to Western markets. Hungary, having begun reforms in the 1980s, proceeded with a mix of shock and gradualism. It liberalized prices and foreign trade quickly, but was slower in privatization, often selling enterprises to strategic foreign investors over time. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, once they regained independence in 1991, implemented far-reaching free market reforms with remarkable speed, eager to integrate with Western Europe. On the other hand, some countries chose a more gradual transition or encountered delays due to political instability. Romania and Bulgaria struggled in the early 1990s with high inflation and hesitant privatization, partly because their post-revolution governments included ex-communists wary of rapid change. In Russia, after the Soviet collapse, President Boris Yeltsin initially tried shock therapy as well, advised by Western economists. In January 1992, Russia freed most prices, leading to an explosive inflation that wiped out savings. Prices in Russia rose by over 2,000% that year, a hyperinflation that impoverished many elderly and fixed-income people. The country also launched a mass privatization through vouchers, which in practice saw former Soviet managers and well-connected businessmen, later dubbed oligarchs, grabbing large stakes in oil, gas, and industrial companies. Russia's experience in the 1990s was particularly tumultuous. Its economy contracted by over 40% in the first half of the decade, a far worse slump than even the Great Depression in the West. This created widespread hardship. Male life expectancy in Russia even fell significantly in the 1990s, as economic stress and the unraveling social safety net took a toll on public health. Across the former Eastern Bloc, the immediate social impacts of transition were harsh. Factories that had been kept running only by state subsidies or by captive markets within the communist bloc suddenly faced competition or lost their customer base entirely. Many had to close, creating mass unemployment, a phenomenon essentially unknown under communism, where labor was guaranteed, if often underutilized. In the early 90s, jobless lines appeared in these societies for the first time in generations. In East Germany, as mentioned, unemployment soared into double digits and remained persistently high through the 1990s. In Poland, unemployment went from near zero in 1989 to over 16% by 1993. Similar spikes occurred in the Baltic states and elsewhere. For older workers who lost jobs, it was especially difficult. Many opted for early retirement if possible. Younger, more mobile people often decided to seek opportunities abroad. We will cover migration in a later section. Another immediate effect was inflation. Under communism, prices were artificially low for basic goods, often causing shortages. But once controls were lifted, prices adjusted to reflect true scarcity and costs. This meant huge jumps. For example, prices for food and fuel shot up overnight when subsidies were removed. Savings held in local currencies by ordinary people were often wiped out by the inflation surge, which was deeply unsettling for societies used to stable, if meaningless on the black market, prices. Suddenly, pensioners found their life savings would barely buy a few loaves of bread. In some countries, people resorted to barter or foreign currencies, like US dollars or German marks, to trade until stability returned. Inequality also increased markedly. Under the old regimes, the income differences were relatively narrow, though privileges existed for the elite. The transition created new winners and losers. Those who could start businesses or had connections to acquire former state assets could become very wealthy, while many others fell into poverty. A new class of entrepreneurs and financiers emerged. Some were genuine, hard-working business people seizing new opportunities, opening import-export firms, restaurants, tech startups. Others operated in more dubious ways, exploiting legal gray zones and the chaos of weak state institutions to amass fortunes. For example, the infamous voucher oligarchs in Russia, who amassed ownership of major companies by buying up privatization vouchers from unaware citizens for a pittance. This sudden inequality led to social frictions, and in some cases, disillusionment with the fruits of capitalism. In surveys a decade after transition, many Eastern Europeans lamented that while they gained freedom, they saw corruption and wealthy elites benefiting disproportionately from the changes. Indeed, majorities in countries like Ukraine, Bulgaria, and Russia believed that politicians and business people had profited from the transition far more than ordinary people. Poland suffered a GDP drop of around 7% in 1990, but by 1992 it stabilized and then embarked on a robust growth path that earned it the nickname the Tiger of Central Europe. Reforms like Bolshevich's shock therapy were credited with quickly taming hyperinflation and laying a foundation for entrepreneurship. By the late 1990s, small shops, private farms, and a vibrant middle class were growing in Poland, though unemployment remained an issue. Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic. After an initial 15 to 20% GDP decline in 1990-91, the Czech Republic recovered relatively fast, helped by its proximity to Western markets and earlier economic development. Prague became a boom town for foreign investment and tourism in the 1990s. its beautiful cityscape symbolizing, in a way, how the country emerged relatively gracefully from communism. Slovakia had a harder adjustment initially, but by late 1990s also found growth. Hungary had been the most market-oriented in the communist era. It had a small private sector, goulash communism. Yet it too saw output fall and inflation high in early 90s. Hungary attracted significant foreign direct investment. Western companies bought stakes in Hungarian banks, factories, and even utilities. This injection of capital helped modernize industries, but sometimes provoked resentment, people seeing foreigners buying up the country. By the late 90s, Hungary's economy was growing, and it was on track to join the EU. The Baltic states had to introduce entirely new currencies: Estonia's kroon, Latvia's lats, Lithuania's litas, after independence, which they managed with remarkable discipline, often pegging them to stable currencies to gain credibility. They implemented swift reforms and saw a sharp but short recession followed by strong recovery mid-decade. The Baltics also had to reorient trade from the former Soviet space to Europe, which was challenging, but they succeeded in diversifying their economies. Russia stands out as a more dire case. Its GDP plunged by roughly 40% between 1991 and 1998. The 1990s in Russia were marked by hyperinflation, especially 1992 fiscal crises and the 1998 financial crash where the government defaulted and the ruble collapsed. The social safety nets, subsidized housing, healthcare, etc., largely crumbled, leading to increased poverty and mortality. It was a decade of extreme hardship for many Russians, which fueled nostalgia among some for the stability, if not the repression, of the Soviet era. Indeed, by 2019, Pew surveys found majorities in Russia and Ukraine saying ordinary people were worse off economically than under communism. This complex legacy would influence politics, as we'll see in the section on democratic challenges. Ukraine, Belarus, and others. Ukraine's economy also shrank dramatically, more than 60% decline in 90s, as it struggled with corruption and slow reforms. Belarus under Lukashenko halted many market reforms, keeping a quasi-Soviet economy. As a result, it avoided some pain, but also stagnated and remained dependent on Russia. Each country had a unique path, but a common theme was the struggle to establish rule of law and transparent governance in the midst of rapid privatization, a situation ripe for corruption and cronyism. Amidst these difficulties, there were also signs of renewal and energy. Small businesses sprang up everywhere, kiosks selling everything from Coca-Cola to homemade goods, private taxi services, open-air markets replacing empty state stores. People appreciated the newfound variety of consumer goods, even if at first many couldn't afford them. For example, East Germans after reunification were famously excited by access to bananas and exotic fruits that had been scarce. The banana frenzy became a symbol of new consumer abundance, and indeed, Western journalists in 1990 often photographed East Germans gleefully eating bananas. In Eastern Europe, Western products and brands flooded in, from Levi's jeans to Sony electronics, giving consumers a sense of joining the modern world. Advertisements and commercial culture blossomed, in contrast to the drab uniformity of communist shops. Crucially, international assistance played a role. The West, United States, European Community, IMF, World Bank, provided various aid packages, loans, and expertise to help the transition. For instance, the IMF coordinated financial stabilization programs to curb hyperinflation in countries like Poland, Bulgaria, and the Baltics. Western advisors, sometimes dubbed shock therapists, influenced policies especially in the early years. The European Community, later EU, started programs like FARI, providing aid and know-how to Poland and Hungary, and later others, to rebuild and reform. There was an overarching strategy to tie economic reforms to eventual prospects of EU membership, effectively using the carrot of integration to encourage difficult reforms. We will delve more into EU expansion in the next section. One cannot discuss the economic transition without mentioning the social toll and the resilience of ordinary people. Families coped by relying on extended kin networks, many cultivated kitchen gardens, or small plots to have extra food. In some countries, barter networks formed, e.g., factories paid workers in goods instead of money when cash was scarce, and workers traded those goods. Retirees often helped care for grandchildren as parents worked multiple jobs or migrated temporarily for work. The informal economy grew, people using personal connections to obtain scarce items or services, something that had precedent under communism, the Blatt system in the USSR, meaning networks of favors. By the late 1990s, the worst of the transition recessions had ended in most of Central and Eastern Europe. Economic growth resumed, inflation was tamed to normal levels, and the new institutions of a market economy, while still developing, were functioning. However, the legacy of the 1990s transition era was mixed in the public memory. In countries that recovered and benefited from EU integration, like Poland or the Baltics, most people came to view the changes positively over time. But in countries where corruption remained rampant and living standards didn't quickly exceed the old days, like Ukraine, Bulgaria, or Russia, until the 2000s resource boom, many people felt ambivalent or negative about the transition. For example, in the late 2010s, over half of Ukrainians, Bulgarians, and Russians said the economic situation was worse than under communism, while large majorities in Poland and the Czech Republic said it was better. Education and age influenced these views. Younger people who didn't personally experience the pre-1989 era, and those with more education were much more likely to favor the move to a market economy. In contrast, older folks often felt left behind by the rapid changes. It's illuminating to consider an example of a personal narrative from this time. A Hungarian factory worker in 1991 might recall how one week he had a secure job at a state enterprise producing machine parts, but little take-home pay and shortages in shops. Then within a year, the factory downsized. He was laid off, but could potentially start a small repair business of his own or seek work abroad. His life became less predictable, but in some ways more his own. Entrepreneurs often describe the early 90s in Eastern Europe with a kind of Wild West nostalgia. It was chaotic, yes, but also a time of excitement when everything was possible and rules were being written anew. A Russian trader who started selling imported computers out of a tiny shop in 1992 might have become a millionaire by 1998, or gone bankrupt in the ruble crash. A lottery-like quality pervaded these societies, replacing the gray certainty of the planned system with the bright uncertainty of markets. From a broader perspective, by the turn of the millennium, the formerly communist economies of Central and Eastern Europe had to varying degrees transformed into market-driven economies integrated with the world. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and others saw foreign investments build modern factories, especially in sectors like auto manufacturing and electronics assembly, leveraging skilled but relatively low-cost labor. Services and finance grew. Tourism boomed in cities like Prague, Budapest, Krakow. The standard of living improved, often surpassing pre-1989 levels, though again, unevenly across regions and social groups. By 2004, when many of these countries joined the EU, their streets looked markedly different than in 1990, filled with new cars, foreign and domestic makes, storefronts of international brands, and busy restaurants and cafes, a consumer society taking root. It is important to underscore that economic transition and democratic transition were intertwined. Economic hardships sometimes fueled discontent that influenced elections and politics. For example, ex-communist parties made comebacks in some countries by promising to alleviate social pain, such as Poland's left-winning elections in 1993 amid reform fatigue. Conversely, the hope of joining the rich Western club via institutions like the EU provided a powerful incentive to keep reforms on track despite short-term pain. In the next section on democratic reforms, we will see more on how these early economic struggles impacted political development. But one more note on the emotional side of the economic transition. It brought freedom of choice to daily life. People could choose what to buy, where to work, in theory, even to start a business, choices they largely lacked before. This was liberating but also stressful. A Polish sociologist in 1995 noted that many people experienced transition stress, a constant anxiety about job security and making ends meet, replacing the old communist-era joke, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us, with a new capitalist imperative to hustle and compete. Over time, as economies stabilized and grew, that acute stress eased for many, but the 1990s left a psychological imprint. It explained, for example, why some older folks in places like Russia or Eastern Germany later expressed a certain nostalgia for the socialist era, nostalgia in Germany, or Soviet nostalgia in parts of the USSR, not necessarily for the political repression, but for the perceived stability and social safety that had existed. Younger generations, in contrast, often found that nostalgia baffling, having embraced the new opportunities and openness of a market society. In closing this section, one can say the transition from plan to market was a critical chapter in Europe's post-1989 history. It was turbulent and uneven, but it set the stage for the longer-term prosperity and integration that many of these countries would achieve. As we drift in this narrative through those early transition years, imagine walking through a city like Warsaw or Budapest around 1991, kiosks lining the sidewalks with colorful Western goods, billboard ads going up where drab slogans once hung, a newly opened McDonald's attracting crowds curious about a Big Mac, while at the same time, elderly pensioners sell homemade pickles or second-hand clothes in street markets to supplement their meager income. It was a world in flux, old certainties melting away, new possibilities emerging. With economies in flux and societies under strain, the political sphere was equally undergoing radical change. Next, we will turn to the efforts at democratic reform and the struggles that accompanied the building of new political systems in post-communist Europe. How did countries write new constitutions, hold free elections, and establish the rule of law? What challenges did they face with corruption, authoritarian backsliding, or nationalism? We will explore these questions in the following section, keeping in mind that economics and politics often went hand in hand during this transformative era. Democratic reforms and challenges in post-communist Europe. The collapse of one-party rule in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union opened the way for an unprecedented wave of democratization in the early 1990s. For countries that had been under authoritarian communist regimes for decades, and before that, often under other forms of dictatorship, the introduction of democracy was exhilarating but fraught with difficulties. Overnight, nations had to create new political systems, write constitutions guaranteeing rights and separation of powers, legalize a spectrum of political parties, develop independent media, and hold free and fair elections, often for the first time in their history, or at least the first time in 2 generations. This process of building democracy, demokratizatsiya, as Gorbachev's term went, but now in a fuller sense, encountered many challenges. While some countries made a relatively smooth transition to stable democratic governance, others experienced political chaos, corruption, the rise of populist or nationalist movements, and even reversals toward authoritarianism. In Central Europe, places like Poland, the former Czechoslovakia, Hungary, the democratic transition largely succeeded, though not without bumps. These nations had certain advantages: a degree of historical memory of pre-Taipui's democratic institutions, and a strong desire to rejoin the West, which incentivized the adoption of Western democratic norms. For example, Poland quickly turned its solidarity movement from an opposition force into a governing one. In 1989, as noted, solidarity-led candidates swept semi-free elections, and by the end of that year, Poland had a non-communist government. The early 1990s saw Poland draft a new constitution, finalized in 1997, and hold multiple competitive elections. Lech Wałęsa, the former shipyard electrician and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, was elected president of Poland in 1990 by popular vote, a profound symbol of change. However, Poland's politics were turbulent. The Solidarity camp splintered into factions. Arguments raged over the pace of economic reform. As mentioned, shock therapy caused social pain, which some politicians sought to slow, and new parties emerged. So, by 1993, post-Solidarity liberals lost parliamentary elections to a coalition that included reformed ex-communists, now calling themselves the Democratic Left Alliance. This peaceful alternation of power was actually a positive sign of democracy maturing. The fact that even ex-communists could gain public trust through the ballot box indicated a degree of reconciliation and a functioning electoral process. But it also reflected that many voters were dissatisfied with the hardships of the transition, and they turned to familiar faces, promising a more secure evolution. In Czechoslovakia, after the Velvet Revolution, the playwright dissident Václav Havel became president in 1989, presiding with moral authority. The country held its first free elections in 1990, producing a parliament with a wide array of parties, from former dissidents to newly formed Christian Democrats to rebranded communists. The process unveiled latent ethnic tensions between Czechs and Slovaks. While united in throwing off communism, the two nations had differing political priorities afterward. Slovak nationalists pushed for more autonomy, feeling that Prague was dominating the federation. This led to the peaceful dissolution of Czechoslovakia in 1993, the Velvet Divorce, creating two independent states, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. It was a negotiated and amicable split, a democratic decision ratified by the parliaments, though some argue a popular referendum should have been held. After separation, both Czechia and Slovakia continued on democratic paths, though Slovakia initially struggled under a semi-authoritarian leader, Vladimír Mečiar, in the mid-1990s, who was accused of curbing media freedom and cronyism. Slovak civil society and opposition eventually defeated Mečiar in elections by 1998, putting Slovakia back on a clearer democratic course, a necessary step for it to join the EU and NATO later. Hungary transitioned relatively smoothly at first. It had its first post-communist free election in 1990, bringing to power the center-right Hungarian Democratic Forum, while the Reform Communist Party had dissolved itself and reinvented as the Socialist Party. Democratic institutions, like a constitutional court, were established and were robust in the 1990s, sometimes striking down legislation that violated rights. Hungary's democracy in the 90s was often lauded as one of the most successful, characterized by a moderate tone and consensus on aiming for EU integration. However, even there, challenges lurked. High-level corruption emerged, as in many transitioning countries, and the seeds of later nationalist populism were planted. Viktor Orban, who in the late 1980s had been a fiery liberal, anti-communist youth leader, drifted to the center-right, and by the 2000s would turn to nationalist conservative politics, eventually dominating Hungary's political scene. More on that later. Elsewhere in the former Eastern Bloc, democratic change proved more fragile. Bulgaria and Romania both initially ended up being led by figures from the old regime who rebranded themselves. In Bulgaria, the Uster of Zivkov led to the Bulgarian Socialist Party, former communists, winning the first election in 1990, though they were pressured into a coalition. Bulgaria had a strong anti-communist opposition, Union of Democratic Forces, that eventually took power in 1991, but the country oscillated between ex-communists and anti-communists through the 90s. Importantly, Bulgaria managed to rewrite its constitution in 1991, establishing a parliamentary democracy and basic civil liberties. Free media started to flourish, with newspapers and broadcasters providing diverse viewpoints. However, corruption and organized crime, not uncommon across the Balkans in the 90s, plagued Bulgaria's politics. The same was true in Romania. After Ceausescu's execution, the National Salvation Front, NSF, led by Ion Iliescu, a former high-ranking communist who had opposed Ceausescu, took power. They won elections in 1990 and 1992, but were accused of using state media and old networks to their advantage. Romania's early 1990s were marred by incidents like the June 1990 Mineriad, when thousands of coal miners, allegedly summoned by Iliescu, descended on Bucharest and violently broke up ongoing anti-government protests and attacked opposition offices. This showed the darker side of transition, elements of the old regime using force and intimidation to cling to influence. Nonetheless, Romania did gradually liberalize. Opposition parties became more organized, and by 1996, a center-right candidate, Emil Constantinescu, defeated Iliescu for the presidency, marking the first peaceful democratic transfer of power to a true opposition in Romania. This was a milestone that indicated democracy taking root, albeit amid continuing struggles with corruption, weak rule of law, and the legacy of the Securitate, Ceausescu's feared secret police. One of the biggest challenges in new democracies was establishing the rule of law and combating corruption. Under communism, the rule of law was a fiction. The party was above the law. Now, making courts independent, training new judges, and dealing with the sins of the past, such as how to handle former secret police collaborators or communist officials, became pressing issues. Different countries took different approaches to lustration, the policy of limiting the participation of former communist officials or informants in the new government. Czechoslovakia, and later the Czech Republic, had one of the strictest lustration laws, barring many ex-STB secret police collaborators from public office for a period. Poland opened some secret files, but chose a more cautious path on lustration initially, fearing witch hunts. East Germany, in cooperation with West Germany, famously opened the Stasi files, millions of pages of records the East German secret police kept on citizens. The Gauck Authority, led by Pastor Joachim Gauck, who later became president of reunified Germany, was set up to allow individuals to access their own files and vet officials. This confronting of the past was painful but also therapeutic for society and helped set a tone of accountability in the new Germany's public life. Corruption, however, burgeoned in the Wild West environment of the transition. Privatization of state assets was a hotbed. Factories, oil companies, banks, all had to be transferred to private hands. In theory, this could be done transparently, but in practice, insiders often exploited the process. Many former communist managers or bureaucrats converted political power into economic power, a phenomenon sometimes called nomenclatura privatization. They had information and connections that allowed them to acquire valuable assets cheaply. Organized crime also entered the fray, especially in the former Soviet Union and some Balkan states, where weak law enforcement provided openings for mafias to take control of certain industries or smuggling routes. This corruption eroded public trust in the new democratic institutions. People saw parliamentarians or ministers enriching themselves and began to doubt whether democracy was delivering on its promise of fairness and rule of law. International organizations like the Council of Europe and Freedom House monitored these changes closely. Freedom House, for example, publishes annual scores for political rights and civil liberties. In the 1990s, countries like the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary rapidly moved into the free category, whereas places like Ukraine or Russia slipped into partly free as democratic progress stagnated or reversed. A Freedom House report in 1999 might note that corruption and lack of transparency remain core structural problems across many post-communist states, and that reforms of judiciary and administrative systems were slow. The media was another crucial element. Suddenly, formerly censored societies had a burst of new media outlets, independent newspapers, radio talk shows, later private TV stations. Investigative journalism in the 1990s flourished to some degree, uncovering corruption scandals. For instance, in Bulgaria, independent newspapers reported on government abuses. However, media independence was not always secure. Wealthy business people or political interests often bought out media outlets, which in some cases led to biased coverage or harassment of truly independent journalists. Still, the difference from the pre-1989 era was night and day. The press was no longer a monolithic propaganda arm. People could openly read and write critical opinions of those in power without fearing imprisonment. Generally, though in some countries, journalists were intimidated or even attacked by mafia elements. Some post-communist states experienced significant political turbulence and conflict, notably in the Balkans. We must mention the catastrophic exception to peaceful transition, the Yugoslav Wars, 1991-1995, and later Kosovo, 1998-99. Yugoslavia was not part of the Soviet bloc in the same way. It had been a non-aligned communist federation, and its collapse followed a different, violent trajectory. As communist authority receded, virulent nationalism took hold. Leaders like Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia and Franjo Tudjman in Croatia harnessed ethnic grievances to carve out power, leading to the bloody dissolution of Yugoslavia. This included ethnic cleansing and genocide, e.g., Srebrenica 1995, the worst atrocities in Europe since World War II. These wars were a stark reminder that democratization did not automatically bring harmony. Where institutions were weak and identities contested, the vacuum could be filled by demagogues and conflict. Eventually, Western intervention and diplomacy, Dayton Accords 1995, NATO action in Kosovo 1999 stopped the wars, and the ex-Yugoslav states, Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, etc., began their own democratization, but on a delayed schedule and with the heavy burden of war trauma. The narrative of those conflicts is its own lengthy story. Within our context, they served as a caution that the end of history triumph of democracy was not universal or easy. Within the former Soviet Union, democratization faced even tougher odds. After the USSR's collapse, Russia did initially have a burst of pluralism. The early 1990s in Russia saw a relatively free press, contentious politics between Yeltsin and a parliament still full of former communists, and new political parties forming. However, Russia's experiment was troubled from the start. In 1993, a constitutional showdown between Yeltsin and the hardline parliament turned violent. Yeltsin ordered the army to shell the White House, Parliament building, forcibly disbanding an obstinate legislature. Afterward, a new constitution gave the presidency enormous powers. This is the constitution still in effect. While Russia continued to hold elections, by the late 1990s, semi-authoritarian tendencies were showing. Oligarchs had big sway over media and politicians. Then, when Vladimir Putin succeeded Yeltsin in 2000, he steadily rolled back democratic freedoms, muzzling media, and centralizing control, a trajectory that fell outside our main European narrative, but significantly affected the overall climate. It meant one of Europe's largest nations turned increasingly away from liberal democracy. Other ex-Soviet states varied. The Baltic countries became healthy democracies and joined the EU. Ukraine oscillated, a flawed democracy in the 90s. Then the Orange Revolution in 2004 gave a boost to democracy, albeit still marred by corruption. Later revolutions in 2014 and conflict with Russia would shape it further. Belarus under Lukashenko became an outright dictatorship by the late 90s. The Caucasus and Central Asia mostly saw authoritarian rule, with a couple exceptions like partial democracy in Georgia after 2003 Rose Revolution. Central and Eastern Europe's democracies in the late 1990s and early 2000s generally solidified to the point that they were admitted into NATO and the EU, which had criteria including democracy and human rights. This was a validation that despite their imperfections, countries like Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, and the Baltic states had built functioning democracies under the rule of law. At the same time, new challenges emerged in the 2000s and 2010s, often referred to as democratic backsliding or the rise of illiberal populism. For instance, Hungary under Orban after 2010 and Poland under the Law and Justice Party after 2015 took steps that critics say undermine judicial independence and free media. These developments show that democracy is never a finished project. It requires continuous nurturing and vigilance. Looking at the human side, Eastern Europeans embraced their new political freedoms with gusto. Voter turnout in the early elections of the 90s was often very high. People felt their vote truly mattered for the first time and stood in long lines to cast ballots. Civic organizations sprang up, everything from human rights watchdogs to environmental groups to cultural clubs, enjoying the freedom to organize. For example, environmental activism, which had been a channel for semi-dissent under communism, became legitimate and led to significant debates on pollution and public health. Recall that communist industries were notoriously polluting. Democratic governments now had to respond to citizen pressure to clean up air and water. Religious institutions, some long suppressed or co-opted, experienced revivals and newfound roles in society. The Catholic Church in Poland regained a respected, if sometimes politically controversial, voice. The Eastern Orthodox Church, repressed under Soviet rule, saw a resurgence in places like Russia and Romania. Ordinary people also had to learn democracy, not just as a system, but as a set of habits, tolerating opposing views, engaging in community decisions, trusting compromise. This civic education was an ongoing process. Schools began teaching civic studies, which had previously been Marxist ideology class, now replaced with concepts of civic rights and responsibilities. By the late 90s, a new generation was coming of age that had little direct memory of communism. Their political outlook was often more optimistic and less burdened by the past, though sometimes also marked by apathy born from seeing the messy reality of politics. One striking aspect was how democracy and national identity often intertwined. Freed from the Soviet Empire, many nations rediscovered suppressed aspects of their heritage. Flags, national anthems, and historical commemorations were revived. For instance, in Ukraine and the Baltics, national languages were given primacy after years of enforced Russification. This cultural reawakening was part of democratization too, affirming the right of people to celebrate their own identity. However, in some cases, it could conflict with minority rights, e.g., Russian minorities in the Baltics sometimes felt marginalized. The Hungarian minority in Slovakia had concerns in the early 90s, etc. Successful democracies has learned to accommodate diversity through minority rights protections, but this was a learning curve as well. By around the year 2000, most of Central Europe and the Baltic states had established what could be considered consolidated democracies, not without corruption or scandals, but fundamentally stable. Southeast Europe, the Balkans, lagged a bit but was progressing post-conflict. Parts of the ex-USSR remained authoritarian or hybrid regimes. The broader European community was working to integrate the post-communist democracies, offering them frameworks and support, like the EU's Copenhagen criteria, which requires stable democracy, rule of law, and human rights for membership. In reflection, the journey of democratic reforms in post-communist Europe was a remarkable narrative of political rebirth. From the peaceful protests in Wenceslas Square and the Baltic Way human chain to the first chaotic parliamentary sessions where former dissidents and former communists shouted at each other but ultimately forged new laws, to the peaceful alternation of power via ballot that would have been unimaginable in the one-party era. These were signs of genuine progress. Yet democracy's path was neither linear nor guaranteed to be permanent. As one Polish commentator wrote in 1995, "We have won our freedom, but now we must learn how to use it," capturing the idea that liberation from oppression was only the first step. The next was building something durable and just in its place. With the political foundations more or less laid by the turn of the millennium, Europe's formerly communist lands were increasingly looking outward toward joining the European Union and redefining the continent's security architecture. The next sections of our journey will explore how the European Union expanded and evolved in response to this new reality, and how NATO and other security frameworks adjusted to a Europe no longer divided by the Iron Curtain. We will see how, through enlargement and integration, Europe sought to weave the East and West together, making future war between them not only unthinkable, but logistically and politically all but impossible. This was the grand project often described as creating a Europe whole and free, the very vision articulated at the Cold War's end. We proceed now to the story of that integration, starting with the European Union's transformation in the 1990s and its bold expansion in the new century. The expansion and evolution of the European Union. As the Cold War drew to a close and Eastern Europe broke free, the European Union, EU, known until 1993 as the European Community, EC, faced an historic opportunity and challenge: how to extend the zone of peace, stability, and prosperity that Western Europe had built over decades to the newly liberated East. The 1990s and 2000s thus became a period of extraordinary evolution for the EU. It transformed from a West European club of 12 countries into a pan-European Union of now 27 countries as of 2025, with several waves of enlargement, the introduction of a single currency, the euro, and development of new political and economic competencies. This process was not only about economics, it was a powerful symbol of European integration, the healing of the continent's divisions, and the fulfillment of the promise that Europeans could be united not by force, but by shared values and voluntary cooperation. In the immediate wake of 1989, the European community moved quickly to support Eastern Europe's transitions. It set up trade and cooperation agreements and aid programs like FAERS, initially for Poland and Hungary, and then extended, which provided funding and expertise for reforms. There was a shared strategic vision, especially championed by leaders like Germany's Helmut Kohl, that anchoring Eastern European countries to Western institutions would secure their democracies and markets and ensure a stable Europe. Kohl and others believed that leaving these countries adrift could risk a slide back into chaos or authoritarianism, which in turn could threaten Europe's security. This sentiment is captured in analysis from the Time noting that the EU's decision to expand eastward was driven by a fear that keeping them out would endanger their economic transition and in turn threaten the prosperity of Western Europe. First, however, the European community needed to remake itself. The end of the Cold War coincided with deepening integration among the existing member states. In 1992, the EC members signed the Maastricht Treaty, which formally created the European Union. The Maastricht Treaty, effective 1993, was a watershed. It outlined plans for economic and monetary union, including a common currency and expanded cooperation into foreign policy and justice home affairs. It also introduced the concept of EU citizenship, allowing citizens of member states to live and work anywhere in the Union and vote in local and European Parliament elections in any member state. These were profound steps toward a more federal-like union. Maastricht was controversial in some countries. For example, Danish voters initially rejected it in a 1992 referendum, narrowly accepting a revised version in 1993. French voters approved it by a razor-thin margin. Yet ultimately, Maastricht set the EU on a dual course, deepening, more integration, and widening, opening to new members. While EU members deepened integration, culminating in launching the euro currency in 1999 for financial transactions and 2002 for notes and coins among initially 12 countries, the aspirations of Eastern neighbors to join grew stronger. By the mid-90s, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and others formally applied for EU membership. The EU set forth criteria for joining, called the Copenhagen Criteria, 1993, which required a stable democracy, rule of law, a functioning market economy, and acceptance of EU laws and norms. This was essentially a roadmap for reform for candidates. Throughout the 90s, these countries worked diligently to meet the criteria, privatizing remaining state industries, strengthening judicial independence, enhancing protections for minorities, and modernizing their laws to align with the EU's acquis communautaire, the body of EU law. The prospect of membership, essentially gaining access to the EU's vast single market and its structural funds, and a seat at the table of European decision-making, was a powerful motivator. It functioned as a kind of soft power leverage for the EU to encourage positive changes. Historians and economists often consider this eastward enlargement as a win-win. It spread stability and shared long-term prosperity to the east while opening new markets and opportunities for the west. Finally, on May 1, 2004, the EU's Big Bang enlargement took place. 10 new countries joined in one go. These were Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all former communist states, plus Malta and Cyprus. It was the largest expansion ever, bringing the EU from 15 to 25 members and adding nearly 75 million new citizens to the Union. The moment was often described in grand terms as the true reunification of Europe, ending centuries of division. For many in the East, it was profoundly emotional. People who in their youth were behind the Iron Curtain were now EU citizens, free to travel, work, and live across a continent without barriers. Celebrations on May 1st, 2004 included fireworks at border towns where old checkpoints had been, or ceremonies of cutting through border fences. A Latvian or Slovak could now drive to Lisbon or Dublin without a visa, something unimaginable decades earlier. This expansion, as analysis confirms, fundamentally changed the way the EU is. Decision-making had to adapt to a more diverse union. The official languages of the EU jumped from 11 to 20, today 24, reflecting the motto, United in Diversity. Institutions were reformed. Voting rules in the Council were adjusted, Nice Treaty 2001, Lisbon Treaty 2007, to accommodate more members. the European Parliament's seats were redistributed. Culturally and economically, the differences between the affluent West and less affluent East had to be managed. The EU provided financial support to new members through structural and cohesion funds, investing in infrastructure, for example, modernizing highways in Poland, water treatment in the Baltics, or business development in Slovakia. Over time, these investments and access to the single market helped many Eastern economies to grow rapidly. Poland, for instance, saw robust GDP growth, and by the 2010s had nearly closed the gap with some Western economies in GDP per capita, adjusted for purchasing power. Indeed, economists have noted substantial trade integration and convergence following enlargement. One study cited suggests EU membership was enormously beneficial to the countries joining, with significant boost to GDP. The new entrants gained not just economically, but also secured their democratic institutions by embedding them in a larger democratic order. However, the enlargement also presented challenges. The EU had to grapple with concerns in existing member states about migration and job competition. For example, workers from Poland or Lithuania could now seek employment in Germany or the UK. Some countries imposed temporary restrictions on free movement. The UK and Ireland notably did not, which contributed to large Polish and Eastern European communities forming there in the late 2000s. By and large, Eastern European migration filled labor shortages in the West, and migrants often returned home with new skills, but politically, it fueled some nativist sentiments in receiving countries. In the long run, studies have shown that the Eastern enlargement contributed positively to overall EU growth, though the benefits were unevenly spread. Another challenge was internal cohesion. Bringing in countries with different historical experiences sometimes meant different perspectives on issues like relations with Russia, the importance of national sovereignty versus EU federalism, etc. For instance, Poland and the Baltic states, with fresh memories of Soviet domination, became strong advocates for a firm line against a resurgent Russia and keen participants in NATO, which we'll discuss in the next section. They also championed further enlargement to countries like Ukraine or Georgia one day, a stance not always fully shared by older EU members wary of extending commitments too far east too quickly. Despite these issues, EU expansion is widely regarded as a success story. By 2007, Romania and Bulgaria also joined the EU, though on a slower track due to needing more reforms, especially on corruption and judicial issues. Croatia followed in 2013, the first of the ex-Yugoslav nations to make it in. In each case, joining the EU was a powerful incentive for positive change. For example, Croatia's cooperation with the UN War Crimes Tribunal and internal reforms were accelerated by its desire to meet EU criteria. The EU's evolution wasn't only about adding members. It also introduced the Schengen area. Most new members joined by 2007, allowing passport-free travel among them and older members, and launched the Eurozone. Many Eastern countries eventually adopted the euro currency, Slovenia in 2007, Slovakia 2009, the Baltics by the mid-2010s, etc. These steps further integrated their economies with Western Europe, reducing transaction costs and symbolizing unity. East Germans had of course adopted the Deutsche Mark and then euro immediately upon reunification, a dramatic equalization that had happened in 1990 at a favorable rate to boost East Germans' purchasing power, though that came with some of the economic distortions described earlier. For other Eastern states, switching to euro was seen as joining an exclusive club. Some, like Poland and Hungary, haven't adopted the euro yet, partly for political reasons, to retain monetary autonomy. Through the 2010s, the EU also had to manage new kinds of challenges, financial crises, like the 2008-2012 Eurozone crisis, a rise in Euroscepticism, and tensions with governments in some member states accused of undermining EU values, e.g., Orban's Hungary, Kaczynski's Poland. Brexit in 2016, the UK's vote to leave the EU, was a shock that somewhat dampened the earlier expansionist zeal of the Union, but it also underscored how deeply Eastern nations wanted to stay in, contrasted with a Western member choosing to exit. Indeed, public support for the EU in Eastern Europe tends to be high, as many associate it with tangible benefits and a return to Europe's family. For Eastern Europeans, joining the EU was often described as a return to where we belong, culturally and historically. As one Czech politician said at the time of accession, "We are coming home to Europe." European identity, which had been artificially split, could flourish whole again. University students could take part in Erasmus exchanges. Businesses in Eastern Europe could receive foreign investment more readily, and environmental and safety standards rose as EU regulations were implemented, e.g., food safety, pollution controls, worker safety rules. There's a charming detail that after 2004, even some nostalgic aspects like Coca-Cola Christmas trucks touring Eastern European capitals or Western-style malls popping up in places like Sofia or Riga became part of the everyday landscape, clear markers of being part of a globalized European economy. Yet integration also meant adjustments. Farmers in Poland or Romania had to adapt to EU agricultural policies. Old industrial regions had to restructure. Governments had to tackle corruption more seriously, with Brussels monitoring. The EU often insisted on reforms even after accession via mechanisms like the cooperation and verification mechanism for judicial reforms in Bulgaria, Romania, or threatened sanctions if core values were breached. This is an ongoing dynamic. The EU as a club has rules and expects members to uphold democratic norms, an issue salient with the rise of illiberal democracy rhetoric in some Eastern capitals recently. Another major facet of EU evolution was its attempts to forge a common foreign and security policy, partly in response to the new post-Cold War environment. The Balkan conflicts of the 90s were a wake-up call that the EU needed to be able to respond to crises on the continent. The EU began deploying peacekeeping or observation missions, like in Bosnia after the war, complementing NATO. It also expanded its neighborhood policy to foster stability, even beyond its enlargements, partnering with countries like Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, through initiatives like the Eastern Partnership in later years. The story of the EU's expansion is in many ways a triumphant one, described rightly as the reunification of East and West Europe by peaceful means. It stands in contrast to so much European history where unification attempts were by conquest. The fact that nations queued up to join, meeting conditions rather than being forced, underscores the magnetic appeal of the EU model at that time. As an IMF report on the 20th anniversary of 2004 enlargement noted, that enlargement was a powerful reminder that European integration is an instrument for peace and not just prosperity. However, with hindsight, some challenges emerged. The rapid growth of some Eastern economies also led to new patterns like migration flows that unsettled some Western voters, exploited by populists. The integration of markets meant that when crises hit, like the 2008 financial crisis, Eastern Europe was deeply affected. E.g., the Baltic states had severe recessions around 2009. Also, some feel that the EU's decision-making, with 27 plus members, has become cumbersome, leading to calls for reform like more majority voting, which smaller or more Eurosceptic members sometimes resist, valuing their veto. Overall, as of the mid-2020s, Eastern European countries have been in the EU for up to 19 years, and in that time, their transformation has been remarkable. To use one concrete example, Estonia, once a Soviet republic with a stagnant planned economy, is now often cited as one of Europe's most digital advanced societies, pioneering e-government. Tech startups like Skype originated there, and its GDP per capita is around 85% of the EU average, up from maybe 30% at independence. Or Poland, it surpassed some Western European countries in GDP total and became a manufacturing hub. These successes owe many factors, including the hard work and resilience of the people, but EU membership provided structure, funds, and a stable framework to flourish within. In the context of our narrative, EU expansion is a key piece of how Europe, after the Berlin Wall, overcame division. It institutionalized the integration that politics had allowed. It gave Eastern Europe a stake in a collective future. And symbolically, think of the European Parliament in Strasbourg with MEPs, members of European Parliament, from across all corners of the continent, sitting together to debate and legislate. Poles and Spaniards, Lithuanians and Germans, something that would have seemed like fantasy to an observer in 1985. Now, parallel to the EU's expansion, there was another crucial integration: NATO enlargement and the redefinition of Europe's security framework. Where the EU provided economic and political integration, NATO provided a security umbrella. Former Eastern Bloc countries were very keen to join NATO to secure themselves, and NATO had to adapt to a new era, including forging relations with a changing Russia. Additionally, beyond NATO, new structures like the OSSE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, grew out of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, CSCE, to include virtually all European countries, offering a forum for dialogue. This is where we turn to next: how Europe's security order was rebuilt after the Cold War, moving from confrontation to cooperation, albeit with some bumps along the way. Thus far, we've seen how Europe's political map was redrawn and its economic alliances realigned. Next, we will examine the Atlantic Alliance's transformation and Europe's broader security architecture in the post-1989 environment, including NATO's role in conflicts like the Balkans and its expansion to include many former adversaries, a process that was as significant for security as EU enlargement was for unity and prosperity. NATO enlargement and new security frameworks. When the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War ended, the very rationale for NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, seemed up for debate. NATO had been founded in 1949 explicitly to counter the Soviet threat and keep Western Europe secure under the U.S. nuclear umbrella. Suddenly, by 1991, the adversary vanished. The Warsaw Pact dissolved, and the Soviet Union broke apart. Some voices even suggested that NATO had outlived its purpose and should disband, perhaps yielding European security to a pan-continental body like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. Yet, as history unfolded, NATO not only persisted, but transformed and expanded, becoming a pillar of the new European security order. In the early 1990s, NATO's future mission was indeed an open question. Western leaders, however, quickly converged on the idea that NATO remained essential as a stabilizing force. The alliance provided, as one U.S. official put it, a basis for stability and integration for all of Europe in the post-Cold War world. Importantly, the newly freed countries of Eastern Europe overwhelmingly saw NATO membership as highly desirable. Having thrown off Moscow's dominance, they wanted the security guarantee that Article 5 of NATO, an attack on one is an attack on all, could provide, especially as a form of insurance against any future Russian revanchism. As noted earlier, none of the ex-Warsaw Pact nations wished to remain in a gray zone that a resurgent Russia might try to dominate again. One of the first tests of the new security framework was German reunification. A key sticking point was whether a unified Germany would be in NATO. The Soviet Union initially objected strongly, but through intense diplomacy in 1990, a compromise was reached. Germany as a whole would be in NATO, but NATO would not deploy non-German NATO troops or nuclear weapons in former East German territory. This, along with economic inducements, helped Gorbachev swallow the bitter pill of a larger NATO on his border. It was also agreed that Soviet troops would peacefully withdraw from East Germany by 1994, aided by generous German financial assistance to resettle them. The final treaties enshrined the principle that all European states could choose their alliances, echoing the Helsinki Final Act of 1975 about freedom to be or not be in alliances. Gorbachev accepted this, probably not foreseeing how far NATO's borders would eventually move east. With Germany unified in NATO, the next question was, what about the rest of Eastern Europe? Initially, NATO was cautious. In the early 90s, American and some West European leaders did not immediately embrace the idea of extending NATO membership to former Warsaw Pact states. There was a sense of not wanting to provoke a still nuclear-armed, if weakened, Russia. Britain and France, in particular, in 1989-92, were skeptical of rapid NATO expansion, and indeed, in 1990 there were diplomatic discussions, still debated by historians, where Western officials suggested to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward beyond Germany. Whether those conversations constituted a firm promise is contested, but they reflect the thinking then that NATO would likely stop at a unified Germany. However, the aspirations of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and others were clear and increasingly vocal by 1993-94. They argued that NATO membership would strengthen them politically and militarily, allowing room for economic development and providing security from possible Russian aggression. In the U.S., the Clinton administration by 1994 shifted in favor of expansion, influenced by both strategic reasoning and domestic politics. Many Eastern European diaspora communities in the U.S. lobbied for it. As Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot put it, not expanding NATO would risk perpetuating the Iron Curtain as a permanent fixture, locking new democracies out of the security alliance. Instead, they chose to bring in new members while trying to make a real post-Cold War mission for NATO in partnership with Russia. This quote shows a dual track: expand NATO and engage Russia, attempting to integrate rather than isolate it. So NATO enlargement began. In 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO, the first former Warsaw Pact countries to do so. This happened on the 50th anniversary of NATO's founding, symbolically significant. It was a time of jubilation in those countries. For example, Polish newspapers hailed "Poland returns to the West," and ceremonies saw their flags raised at NATO HQ. Russia's government, under Yeltsin at that time, publicly grumbled, but was relatively weak and also somewhat mollified because NATO simultaneously created the NATO-Russia Founding Act, 1997, establishing a NATO-Russia Council, a consultative body meant to give Russia a voice, though not a veto, in European security matters. This was part of NATO's approach to say, we'll expand, but also build a cooperative relationship with Moscow. The idea was to overcome Cold War divisions by eventually making Russia a partner. NATO also adapted its mission beyond territorial defense. In the 1990s, the Balkan Wars provided both a test and an opportunity. NATO conducted its first ever military operations out of ease, outside its members' territory, in Bosnia. Initially, NATO enforced a no-fly zone, and then, in 1995, launched airstrikes against Bosnian Serb forces to pressure an end to the war. Russia opposed these strikes, identifying ethnically and politically with the Serbs, but could do little except diplomatically complain. The resulting Dayton Peace Accords saw NATO lead a large peacekeeping force, I4GSSFOR, in Bosnia, which even included Russian troops as a small contingent, a rare moment of NATO-Russia field cooperation in the 90s. Then in 1999, NATO undertook a controversial air war against Yugoslavia, Serbia, and Montenegro to halt violence in Kosovo. Again, Russia was unhappy, but as before, it couldn't stop it, though it did participate in diplomatic efforts and then in the Kosovo Force, KFOR, peacekeeping with a sector for Russian troops. These interventions marked NATO's transformation into an active crisis management and peacekeeping agent, not just a static defense pact. The alliance had effectively taken on the role of ensuring stability in Europe's post-Cold War hotspots when the UN was paralyzed, owing to Russian vetoes at times. In the early 2000s, NATO undertook a second big enlargement, 2004, inviting 7 more countries, the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovenia, Slovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. This moved NATO to 26 members and directly to Russia's borders. The Baltics share frontiers with Russia. By this time, Russia was under Putin and much more uneasy about NATO's creep. While Putin initially was cordial with the West, even cooperating on counterterrorism after 9/11, he drew a line at further expansion into ex-Soviet space beyond the Baltics. For the Eastern Europeans, however, joining NATO was a huge relief. The Baltic states, in particular, having vivid memories of Soviet occupation and lacking the strategic depth of larger nations, felt truly secure for the first time once under NATO's wing. A Lithuanian diplomat said, "Now we will not be left alone if something happens." Notably, NATO membership for them also eventually meant NATO air policing. Since they have small or no air forces, other NATO jets patrol their skies, a sign of tangible solidarity. NATO also expanded its missions in the 2000s beyond Europe, e.g., taking command of ISAF in Afghanistan, reflecting how it redefined security to global threats like terrorism. But within Europe, a key new concept was building a wider European security architecture with multiple institutions, NATO, the EU, and the OSCE each playing roles. The OSCE, grown out of the older CSA process, was an inclusive forum including Russia and others. It worked on conflict prevention, e.g., field missions in places like Ukraine, Georgia, the Balkans, election monitoring, and promoting human rights. While not as powerful as NATO or EU, OSCE embodied the principle that security is comprehensive, including human rights and economic cooperation. It reflected hopes in the 90s that Russia could be integrated into a cooperative order. Gorbachev had spoken of a common European home, and Western leaders mooted ideas like eventually building an OSCE-based collective security system. But in practice, OSCE remained limited by consensus decision-making. Russia often blocked things it disliked, and NATO-EU became the preferred vehicles for integration by Western and Central Europeans. A new framework created specifically to engage former Soviet states was the Partnership for Peace, PFP, launched by NATO in 1994. PFP offered military cooperation and training to any European state that wanted it, including Russia. It was sort of a preparatory pool from which many Eastern countries graduated to full membership. Russia did join PFP and was fairly active for a while in joint exercises. But as NATO expanded, and particularly after 2004, Russian-Western relations began to sour. The Russians felt misled, or at least aggrieved by NATO's expansion, and argued NATO had pledged not to expand. Again, the controversy of 1990 promises. NATO and Western leaders insisted no formal promise was breached and that sovereign nations chose freely to join. This debate aside, by the late 2000s, the security landscape had NATO and EU encompassing most of Europe, with a few notable gaps, the former Yugoslav states still catching up. Croatia joined NATO in 2009, others like Serbia remain non-aligned, and the post-Soviet states outside the Baltics, Ukraine, Georgia, etc., in a gray zone contested between Euro-Atlantic orientation and Russian influence. The Georgia War of 2008 and Ukraine crisis of 2014, with Russia's annexation of Crimea and wars in eastern Ukraine, dramatically illustrated that Europe's security framework was still incomplete and fragile at its eastern edges. Those crises stemmed in part from Russia's vehement opposition to its neighbors moving toward NATO-EU. They signaled a return of tension, not unlike a mini-Cold War. However, during the time frame we're covering, mostly 90s-2000s, the overarching theme was the broad reduction of military confrontation in Europe. If you look at the 1990s, huge arsenals were being reduced thanks to arms control agreements like the CFE Treaty, conventional forces in Europe. Soviet-Russian forces withdrew from former satellites. Ex-adversaries were becoming allies. For example, Polish and German soldiers served side by side in NATO peacekeeping in the Balkans, a stark contrast to being on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain. NATO's presence in Eastern Europe was initially minimal, no permanent bases, due to sensitivity, but after 2014, NATO did place rotating battle groups in Baltic states and Poland as reassurance, not a Cold War-level troop presence but symbolic tripwires. The OSCE remained useful. For instance, it had an observer mission in Ukraine's conflict zone until Russia expelled it in 2022. A word on nuclear security. With the Soviet collapse, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan suddenly had nuclear weapons on their territory, former Soviet arsenal. In a crucial 1994 agreement, the Budapest Memorandum, those countries agreed to give up these nukes to Russia in exchange for security assurances on their sovereignty from Russia, the US, and UK. That was part of shaping a safer Europe. Unfortunately, Russia violated that memorandum in 2014 in Ukraine, which retrospectively caused some to question whether disarmament was wise for Ukraine. But at the time it was hailed as a big step for non-proliferation. Western experts worked through programs like Nunn-Lugar to help dismantle ex-Soviet warheads and secure materials. Another new security dimension was pan-European norms, often hammered out in OSCE documents or Council of Europe conventions. The Charter of Paris 1990 by CSCE leaders proclaimed a new era of democracy, peace, and unity in Europe, setting principles of democracy and human rights as the foundation of security. The Council of Europe, not an EU body but a human rights org that basically all European states except Belarus joined, expanded eastward too, bringing eastern states under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. These soft security frameworks aimed to prevent a relapse into dictatorship or conflict by tying countries to common values and legal standards. It was part of the idea of European security community, an old concept meaning states see each other as partners, not enemies. Looking at human experience, for citizens in Eastern Europe, joining NATO was less visibly transformative than joining the EU. NATO doesn't affect daily consumer life, but it gave psychological comfort. Many recall growing up with Soviet soldiers stationed in their country. Now, as part of NATO, they themselves had American, British, or German troops occasionally exercising on their soil as friends. I remember how, for instance, villagers in Poland near training areas would come out to greet NATO troops with curiosity and often hospitality, a far cry from the suspicion with which they regarded Soviet garrisons. Similarly, Baltic air policing missions, where, say, Spanish or Canadian jets rotate to guard Baltic airspace, are little ceremonies when they arrive, reflecting solidarity. These are small anecdotes, but they show an ethos of unity among many nations with historically very different experiences. From a calm narrative perspective, one could imagine the scene of a NATO ceremony in the late 90s, perhaps the lowering of the old flags and raising of new ones at some base, symbolizing how once hostile armies were integrating. Or OSCE monitors walking through a tranquil border village that in Cold War days was fortified and now is open. In summary, new security frameworks in Europe after the Cold War included NATO's adaptation and enlargement, turning from confrontation with the East to integrating former Eastern Bloc members and taking on peace operations. EU's developing security role too. They started a common foreign and security policy, and later even a small EU defense identity, though NATO remained primary. OSCE as an inclusive forum to maintain dialogue and preventative diplomacy across the whole region. Bilateral treaties, e.g., many Eastern countries signed friendship treaties settling past grievances, like Poland and Ukraine, or Hungary and Romania, often facilitated by the West to reduce minority disputes. NATO Russia and OSCE attempts to include Russia in a cooperative order, albeit ones that ultimately faltered as Russia's path diverged. One could say that by the early 2000s, Europe had built a multi-layered security architecture. It wasn't flawless, but it was a world away from the bipolar standoff of the Cold War. European nations no longer expected war with each other, for the first time perhaps ever, historically. NATO and EU expansion had gone a long way toward fulfilling the vision of a Europe whole and free. The fact that countries that once belonged to the Warsaw Pact were now treaty allies of the US and Western Europe within NATO, participating in joint missions, was an extraordinary turnaround. Integrating militaries required trust building, e.g., former Soviet-educated officers adjusting to NATO standards and English as the lingua franca, but it mostly succeeded. Yet as we know today, the story of European security is not finished. The legacies of Cold War still reverberate, notably in Russia's relationships with neighbors and the West. As of our narrative's scope, roughly up to the 2010s, the main trend had been expanding security and stability, but seeds of renewed tension were there. However, to keep with our gentle, reflective tone, suitable for late night, we might note that for a time, it really seemed that Europe had entered a post-history phase where war was unthinkable, aside from those tragic Balkan conflicts that were contained and resolved. Now, moving from security and politics, our narrative should address how all these transformations influenced everyday life, culture, and identity. The next focus will be cultural and educational renewal, how societies once under censorship opened up culturally, from literature and arts to academic freedom and exchange. Then we will discuss migration and identity, how the lifting of the Iron Curtain allowed people to move freely, creating new diversity, but also brain drains and identity questions, and how Europe dealt with the psychological legacy of division, all while maintaining our calm storytelling, picturing perhaps a student from Prague studying in London, or a rock band from Lithuania touring Europe. Things that illustrate the human face of a reconnected Europe. Cultural and educational renewal in post-communist societies. When the strictures of communist rule were lifted in Eastern Europe, a great cultural and intellectual blossoming began. Societies that had been kept under ideological lock and key for decades suddenly found themselves free to explore, revive, and reinvent their cultural life. The early 1990s were a time of cultural renaissance in post-communist countries. Banned books were published openly, suppressed chapters of history were researched and taught, artists experimented without fear of censorship, and people reconnected with cultural currents from beyond the Iron Curtain. This renewal was not just about recovering what was lost under communism, it was also about embracing new ideas and global influences in art and education and media. The atmosphere was one of exhilarating rediscovery and creative ferment. Under the communist regimes, censorship and propaganda had heavily distorted cultural life. Certain works of literature, philosophy, and art were forbidden if they contradicted socialist realism or party lines. Many writers and filmmakers were either silenced or forced into samizdat, underground circulation of texts. Education, too, was politicized. History was taught with ideological spin, and academic freedom was constrained. After 1989, these chains were broken. As one Bulgarian writer put it, books needed to be liberated too after decades of censorship. Indeed, across the region, there was a rush to publish previously banned authors. In Czechoslovakia, later the Czech Republic, the works of exiled or dissident writers like Josef Škvorecký and Milan Kundera became widely available at home for the first time. In Hungary, before 1989, the great poems of 1956 or critical essays had been hidden. Now they were in every bookstore. In Romania, Books by Mircea Eliade, the famous historian of religion who had emigrated, or George Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm, keenly relevant allegories, sold in huge numbers when finally uncensored. Publishing itself had to be rebuilt. During communism, all publishing houses were state-controlled and tightly monitored. After, many private publishers sprang up, though they faced challenges like lack of capital and distribution networks. The Council of Europe aided in this liberation of books, training publishers, and developing financing systems so that important works could be printed. One anecdote. In 1992, it was reported that Freud's works had yet to be translated into Bulgarian, a sign of the isolation from Western intellectual trends. That gap closed quickly as translation projects proliferated. Western foundations and charities helped stock university libraries with modern textbooks and classics that had been missing. Seminal works of European literature began reaching readers who'd never had access before. Meanwhile, the arts, music, theater, visual arts, broke free from constraints. In many countries, a vibrant underground culture had existed, rock music, scenes, informal art groups, but now they could come into the open and even receive public support. For example, in the GDR, East Germany, youth who listened to Western rock had been harassed. After unification, East Berlin saw a flourishing of clubs, techno music, and arts squats. The 1990s turned the reunified city into a cutting-edge cultural capital. In Prague, the Velvet Revolution elevated people like the dissident playwright Václav Havel to the presidency, and artists gained a special prestige as heralds of freedom. It was common to hear it said that now art can be just art, not propaganda. Some older state cultural institutions struggled to adapt or lost subsidies, but new independent theaters and galleries opened, often with bold contemporary styles. In Poland, theaters staged avant-garde plays that would have been censored before. Filmmakers tackled previously taboo subjects, like cat and massacre, religious themes, or simply making escapist genres without ideological messaging. The film industry benefited from the end of censorship. For instance, in Russia, the early 90s saw an explosion of honest films about Soviet history, like those dealing with Stalinist purges or the Afghan War, as well as artsy experimentation in cinema. One of the most striking transformations was in the media and journalism. During communism, the press was a controlled mouthpiece. Now dozens of independent newspapers, radio stations, and later TV channels emerged. Journalists, once shackled by political editors, embraced investigative reporting. They uncovered truths about the past, such as revealing secret police collaborators and crimes, and exposed current corruption. A Bulgarian radio journalist described how previously the news was what the party decreed. Suddenly, we had to find the news and report it truthfully. It was like breathing oxygen after drowning, a paraphrase of a common sentiment. Media diversity meant people could read different political perspectives: liberal, conservative, nationalist, socialist, in a robust public debate. Of course, these new freedoms also led to challenges, some sensationalism, influence by wealthy owners, etc., but undeniably the information space was far freer. Independent press and party newspapers blossomed, although in some places they faced pushback, e.g., Romania early on had intimidation of opposition papers by elements of the old guard. Overall, the new media served as a watchdog on fledgling democracies and an avenue for citizen voices long suppressed. Education underwent a vast reform. Communist-era curricula were heavily revised or thrown out. For example, history textbooks were rewritten to include truths that had been excised. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet occupation's dark sides, the 1956 Hungarian uprising, the Prague Spring, etc., now could be taught honestly. Teachers, who had sometimes been forced to teach lies, could now encourage critical thinking, though they also needed new materials and training to adjust to that. Civics education was introduced in place of Marxism-Leninism classes, teaching concepts like democratic institutions, human rights, and civic responsibility. David Mardell, recalling the early 90s for the Council of Europe, noted an ingenious system of financing was put in place, where profits from revising old ideologically skewed school books were used to fund translations of Western literature and new publications. That is, rewriting textbooks, cutting the communist bias, not only fixed education, but also raised money to broaden cultural offerings. Universities gained academic freedom. Many established new departments. Economics departments could now teach market theory rather than only planned economy. Political science departments could openly discuss pluralism and democracy. Western scholars began traveling east to lecture, and Eastern scholars and students went west to study, often through exchange programs like Erasmus, once these countries joined the EU, or even before, via special programs. Consider a young student from, say, Latvia in the late 90s. She could now perhaps spend a semester in Paris or Amsterdam, an experience older generations behind the Iron Curtain could hardly imagine. Language and cultural identity enjoyed revivals too. Under communism, Russification policies had suppressed local languages in some places, or at least made Russian the de facto lingua franca in Eastern Bloc dealings. After independence or regime change, countries prioritized their native tongues in public life and schooling. For example, the Baltic states moved quickly to restore Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian to primacy, while still accommodating minorities, though the transition was at times controversial regarding citizenship laws and language tests. National cultural heritage found new recognition. Folk traditions, religious customs, and national holidays that had been discouraged were celebrated openly. Churches, which often played a quiet resistance role, experienced renewal. Congregations swelled in many areas during the transitional years as people sought spiritual meaning or simply the freedom to worship. Pope John Paul II's visits to Poland and other countries in the 90s were massive public events, symbolizing how religion could re-enter the public square after atheist regimes. One striking cultural development was the addressing of historical memory. Basically, a culture of remembrance and reflection formed. Museums and memorials were established to commemorate the victims of totalitarian regimes. For instance, the Museum of Occupations in Tallinn or the House of Terror in Budapest. Archival research uncovered truths about Stalinist repression, and societies engaged in debates about how to deal with former oppressors, like opening secret police archives. In East Germany, the Stasi Records Agency allowed citizens to read their files, which was therapeutic but also painful. Writers and filmmakers grappled with these memories in novels and films, which became part of the cultural healing process. For example, the Czech film Kolya, 1996, though a personal story, reflected on changes after the Soviet era. Polish director Andrzej Wajda's film Korczak, or later Cotton, confronted WTS and post-war tragedies that communist censorship had clouded. A dimension of cultural renewal was also international cultural exchange. Eastern European artists, musicians, and students could finally travel widely. Western cultural products flooded east, some worry too much, a lament in mid-90s. Eastern Europe was the avalanche of Hollywood movies, and pop music might drown out local culture, but local culture proved resilient, often blending global and local forms. Conversely, Western audiences gained more exposure to Eastern European culture. Think of the global success of Czech writer Ivan Klima's works in translation, or Polish composer Henryk Górecki's Symphony No. 3 topping charts in the 90s, or the worldwide tours of the St. Petersburg, formerly Leningrad Philharmonic, once travel was easier. The cultural Iron Curtain fell as surely as the physical one. With so much freedom, there were also growing pains. For example, state funding for the arts dropped precipitously in many places as economies struggled, so artists had to adapt to market realities. Some old cultural institutions, like state film studios or writers' unions, lost their privileged status and had to either reform or face irrelevance. Not every formerly repressed artist automatically thrived in the new system. Some found the competition and lack of guaranteed audience challenging. Also, Western culture's influx meant local creators had to strive to maintain audience interest in homegrown art. But many did by drawing on authentic experiences of the transformation itself, making art about the transition. The 90s literature is full of semi-autobiographical novels about navigating the new chaotic freedom, often with humor or pathos. Education systems, aside from content, also reformed structures. Universities got more autonomy. Collaborations with Western institutions sprang up. Joint research, twinning between universities. Many Eastern European youth began learning Western European languages. With zeal, English especially became sought after, replacing Russian as the default second language taught. This opened up further opportunities for study and work abroad. We will detail migration soon. Civil society more broadly, beyond formal education and arts, saw a renaissance. People formed NGOs on everything from environmental issues to women's rights to civic education. Under communism, such independent civic activity was nearly impossible unless it was regime-sanctioned. Now, aided sometimes by Western foundations, a non-profit sector emerged to tackle social problems and advocate policies. Cultural NGOs helped preserve heritage or run cultural events bridging East-West. For instance, there was a Baltic Culture Fund by the Nordic countries to support arts in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or the Soros Foundations, funded by financier George Soros, which in the 90s poured resources into education, media, and arts freedom in Eastern Europe, establishing everything from internet connections for universities to new libraries. These often catalyzed local creative communities. Later, Soros's name would become controversial in some places for political reasons, but undeniably in the 90s, his Open Society Institute had significant positive impact on cultural and educational rebuilding. A symbolic milestone in educational renewal was when, for example, Central European University, CEU, was founded in 1991 with campuses in Prague, later moved to Budapest, as a new Western-style social sciences university for the region, a tangible sign of new academic life. Or think of the reopening of once banned academic fields like sociology, political science, and anthropology. Under communism, these were suspect disciplines. Sociology was often not taught because it implied examining society critically. In the 90s, these fields grew at universities, often with Western educated returnees taking up posts. Young academics could for the first time attend international conferences without needing party approval, provided they could get travel funding. Early on, money was a constraint, but gradually international exchange programs fixed that. Science and technology research benefited as well. The Cold War had isolated Eastern scientists, except in limited fields. Now they could join global projects, and Western labs welcomed bright minds. We see, for example, many mathematicians and programmers from Eastern Europe making a mark globally once they gained access to the wider scientific community. Countries like Poland and Hungary, which had strong science traditions, worked to reintegrate. Over time, as Eastern states joined the EU, they became part of European research funding schemes, further enhancing collaboration. In everyday cultural consumption, there was a novelty in the early 90s. People tuning into newly available foreign TV channels via satellite, CNN, BBC, MTV, these suddenly gave a window on the world that before was limited to maybe jamming-resistant shortwave radio or clandestine tapes. Cinemas, once showing only approved films, plus a few vetted Western ones, could now screen anything that distributors brought in. The effect on imagination and worldview was enormous. A teenager in 1988 East Berlin could maybe only watch tame East German or Soviet youth films. In 1992, he could watch Star Wars or Jurassic Park in a newly opened multiplex. Similarly, Eastern cities saw new cultural venues, Western-style bookstores with shelves of previously unobtainable books, from sci-fi novels to business manuals, or music stores selling the latest international pop rock CDs legally as opposed to black market. Meanwhile, some cultural quirks from communist times persisted or were fondly remembered. In former East Germany, for example, certain children's cartoons or comic characters from the GDR era remained beloved by kids, no longer politicized but part of shared culture. Cultural exchange wasn't one way. Eastern European culture also traveled west. Art exhibits of formerly hidden, dissident art from, say, Czechoslovakia toured Western galleries. Eastern European cuisine, dance troupes, literature festivals began to be part of the broader European tapestry. Western curiosity about life behind the Iron Curtain translated into interest in Eastern stories, which many writers and filmmakers provided. Think of the late 90s and early 2000s, a film like Poland's Ida, or novels by Hungarian author Péter Esterházy found wide translations and audiences, enriching global culture. Another aspect was the digital revolution hitting Eastern Europe roughly concurrently with the West. In fact, many Eastern countries jumped directly from outdated 1980s analog systems to modern 1990s tech, leapfrogging some intermediate steps. Governments and cultural institutions, with Western help, computerized archives and modernized telecommunications. Estonia famously embraced the internet early, making itself an e-society by the 2000s, earning the moniker Estonia. This digital leap helped Eastern Europe integrate culturally and informationally with the world even faster. Cultural and educational renewal also meant some difficult confrontations with identity and values. For instance, open discussions on previously suppressed issues, such as the plight of ethnic minorities, e.g., the Roma in Eastern Europe, gender equality, or LGBTQ rights, began to emerge. Under communism, these topics were often ignored, apart from official claims of equality that masked reality. Now, intellectuals and activists could research and speak out. In the 90s, feminist and human rights NGOs formed, student groups on campuses debated sensitive issues that previously one wouldn't dare mention publicly. Societies had to face uncomfortable parts of their culture too, like latent anti-Semitism or homophobia that had been neither addressed nor openly expressed under communism's veneer of we solved prejudice. A free cultural climate allowed these issues to be aired, though not without contention. For example, how to treat the communist period in school textbooks was debated. In some places, it was termed an illegitimate occupation, in others treated as a misguided period, but part of national history. Memorials went up to victims of communism, but also some old anti-fascist monuments were re-evaluated. Some saw them as Soviet propaganda and removed them. Others left them as historical. From a calm narrative vantage, we might imagine a scene in 1990 of, say, a dusty bookstore in Prague receiving its first shipment of previously banned books, readers crowding in hungry for truth and art, or a village school teacher in Ukraine telling students about the Holodomor famine truthfully for the first time, with elderly villagers coming to class to share memories long suppressed, or a gallery opening in Budapest where abstract paintings that once had to be shown in secret are now proudly on the wall with the public strolling through. The phrase reviving cultural life truly encapsulates it. These societies, culturally, felt a reawakening. A Council of Europe observer in 1990s wrote that after communism collapsed, artists no longer had to serve propaganda, but could be creative for creativity's sake. There's a poignant line from that source. Nations that had languished for years under dictatorships more interested in propaganda than in real art now had all kinds of creative possibilities. The Secretariat of the Council of Europe took initiatives to help retrieve their cultures. For instance, staging joint art exhibitions that bridged East and West, proving culture could unify where politics had divided. Finally, the cultural renewal contributed to a broader sense of European identity in the East. People no longer felt cut off from Europe's heritage. A Polish student visiting Paris or a Sloven musician collaborating in Vienna, these interactions reinforced that Eastern Europe was an integral part of Europe, sharing in its cultural legacy from classical music to modern art. Eastern Europeans often framed their post-communist journey as a return to Europe, culturally as well as politically. This helps to heal the Cold War's psychological division, which had made Eastern Europeans feel second class or outside. All in all, cultural and educational renewal was one of the most uplifting and human aspects of the post-1989 transformation. It operated at a personal level, in minds opened and souls nourished by truth and beauty after years of drab conformity. As we proceed, we will see how these cultural changes intersected with other facets like migration and identity, since open cultural life often spurred people to explore beyond their borders and reconsider who they were in a changing world. In the next section, we'll delve into how the end of the Cold War allowed mass movements of people previously impossible, east-west migration, returning exiles, exchanging populations, and how Europeans grappled with evolving identities, whether national, regional, or continental, in the post-war era. We'll also look at the legacy of Cold War divisions in shaping generational perspectives and memory, tying back to some cultural aspects, like nostalgia or the processing of history. Let us continue in our gentle, late-night narrative style, reflecting on families reuniting across old borders, or young adults embracing a broader identity than their parents could. Migration, identity, and the legacy of Cold War divisions. With the lifting of the Iron Curtain, Europe experienced a profound movement of people and a re-examination of identities that had long been constrained. During the Cold War, international migration from east to west was minimal and often involved dangerous escapes or political exile. Travel was tightly controlled. Families were split between sides with slim hopes of reunion. After 1989, suddenly the borders opened. Eastern Europeans could for the first time freely visit or move to Western Europe, and vice versa. This unleashed pent-up migratory flows, people seeking economic opportunity, rejoining relatives, or simply exploring the world that had been off-limits. At the same time, the end of communism prompted internal migrations and ethnic movements, some voluntary, some forced by conflicts like in Yugoslavia. These migrations, along with the societal transformation, spurred Europeans to grapple with questions of identity. What did it mean to be Eastern or Western now? How to integrate communities that had been separated for so long? And how to come to terms with the Cold War's legacy in the collective memory and among different generations? One of the earliest significant flows was the migrations of ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe and the former USSR to Germany around the time of reunification. West Germany had long maintained a policy to welcome Aussiedler, ethnic Germans from places like Poland, Romania, or Kazakhstan, but during the Cold War travel was hard. Once borders eased, hundreds of thousands took the opportunity to relocate to Germany in the early 1990s. This was one part humanitarian, rejoining nation or fleeing hardship, and one part brain drain as skilled workers left Eastern nations. Similarly, Jews from the former Soviet Union emigrated in large numbers once allowed. Many went to Israel or the US, but tens of thousands also settled in Germany, radically altering the Jewish community there, which had nearly been erased in the Holocaust, and now saw an influx of Russian-speaking Jews. Those migrations sometimes caused strain. For instance, in Germany in the early 90s, sudden arrivals put pressure on housing and social services, and there was unfortunately a rise of xenophobic incidents in some areas, as some Germans reacted poorly to the influx, especially of those who, while ethnically German, spoke only Russian or needed integration. But Germany persevered, investing heavily in integration courses. A dramatic migration phenomenon was the east-to-west economic migration that accelerated through the 1990s, and especially after EU enlargements in 2004 and 2007. Initially, right after 1989, many Eastern Europeans traveled west, not permanently, but as traders or temporary workers. For example, Poles and others would take overnight buses to Berlin or Vienna to sell goods in flea markets, the so-called suitcase trade, bringing wares like Polish pottery or East German vintage items and returning with Western products to sell at home. This was an early form of entrepreneurial exchange in the wild new market reality. Over time, as visa regimes liberalized and then fell away, Eastern Europeans moved for jobs. Construction workers from the Baltics and Sweden, nurses from Slovakia and Austria, farm laborers from Romania and Italy, IT specialists from Poland and the UK, and so on. Entire communities formed abroad. By the late 2000s, Polish was said to be Britain's second most spoken language due to a wave of Poles, estimated near 1 million at peak, who came after Poland's EU entry in 2004. These migrations had multiple effects. They helped rejuvenate aging Western European workforces and filled labor shortages, but they also led to some domestic political debates in those countries about wages and social impact. Immigration became a hot topic and was partly behind events like Brexit in 2016. For the Eastern countries, emigration alleviated high unemployment in the 90s, but also sometimes created a brain drain problem, as many young educated people left for better pay in the West, leaving skill gaps at home. On the other hand, some migration flowed eastward too. With new business opportunities, Western Europeans went to Eastern Europe to work in multinational branches, start companies, or teach languages. Cities like Prague, Warsaw, and Budapest in the 90s developed small expat communities of Westerners, giving them a more cosmopolitan vibe. One could now find an Englishman running a pub in Budapest or a Frenchwoman heading a marketing firm in Warsaw. These were things unheard of under communism, when foreigners in Eastern capitals were mostly diplomats or spies under heavy surveillance. Tourists also poured in. For Western Europeans, the other half of their continent that had been mysterious and inaccessible was now open. They eagerly visited the architectural treasures of Prague or the Baltic seaside or the Carpathian Mountains, often amazed at how European and yet unique these places felt. Tourism became a key industry and also a form of cultural exchange. A more tragic migration was the refugee flows from the Balkan Wars. When Yugoslavia fell apart in the early 1990s, hundreds of thousands of people, Bosniaks, Croats, Serbs, Kosovars, etc., were displaced by violence. Many found asylum in other European countries. For instance, Germany took in large numbers of Bosnian refugees during 1992-95. Sweden accepted many as well. Communities of Yugoslav origin spread across Europe, some returning after the wars, others settling permanently and adding to Europe's tapestry of diversity. These conflicts and resulting migrations were a stark reminder that while the Iron Curtain was gone, ethnic and national tensions could still erupt. Europe had to adapt its humanitarian response mechanisms, cooperating through the EU and UN to aid and resettle those fleeing war. In the longer run, some refugees returned to rebuild, especially after 1995, but others integrated into their host societies. Within post-communist countries, there was also internal migration. The transition often hit certain industries or regions hard, e.g., mining areas or Soviet-era factory towns faced closures, causing people to move from depressed rural or industrial areas to capitals or to Western Europe. For instance, East Germany saw a continued exodus of East Germans to the more prosperous West throughout the 1990s. As mentioned earlier, hundreds of thousands left the Eastern Länder for jobs in Bavaria or Hamburg. This had a significant social effect. Some Eastern regions lost a generation of young talent, leaving behind aging populations and imbalanced demographics. The German government poured investment into the East to try to stem this, and by the 2000s, the gap had narrowed, though even today differences linger, e.g., higher unemployment in some eastern areas, a phenomenon that has influenced politics and identity there. Similarly, countries like Poland saw young people drift from small towns to Warsaw or Krakow or abroad, leading to localized decline in some villages, but also a spread of ideas as returnees sometimes brought back capital and experiences. These population movements made identity a more fluid concept. People who migrated often had to navigate blending into new cultures while preserving their own. A Polish plumber working in London might, after some years, feel both Polish and a bit British. His children, if born in the UK, would straddle identities. Meanwhile, back in Poland, exposure to foreigners and returnees broadened society's outlook, but also prompted questions. What does it mean to be Polish in a more open Europe? Debates on national identity versus European identity grew. The EU's integration promoted a sense of being European, particularly among the younger, well-traveled generation, whereas older folks who had spent much of life in isolation sometimes felt more rooted solely in their national identity. Surveys reflect some of these divides, with younger Central Eastern Europeans generally more positive about post-communist changes and international integration than older ones. The legacy of Cold War divisions manifested in various ways in the collective consciousness. One aspect was a lingering sense among Eastern Europeans of being catching up to the West. Even as they integrated and migrated, some felt a stigma or second-class status. For example, there was sometimes resentment when Western Europeans stereotyped Eastern workers as cheap labor or Eastern countries as backward. These prejudices did exist in the 90s and 2000s at times. Conversely, Westerners traveling east occasionally faced suspicion or envy in the early years. Rich tourists, though over time those barriers fell. By now, a generation has grown up for whom East-West within the EU is not a sharp division, but just part of the diversity of Europe. Generational change is crucial here. Young people born around or after 1989 had a fundamentally different experience than their parents. They grew up with freedom of speech, travel, and more prosperity, albeit with new challenges. Many could not personally remember the Berlin Wall or communist life. They learned about it from school or their elders, almost as a distant story. This has led to a bit of a generation gap in memory. Older generations often carry vivid memories of hardship or oppression under communism, as well as the early chaotic 90s. Some older folks even felt nostalgia for aspects of the old system, known as Ostalgie in East Germany or similar terms elsewhere, usually nostalgia not for the repression, but for the stability or social welfare, AEGs, guaranteed jobs, certain communal values. For instance, a retired East German might recall how everyone had employment and housing was cheap, and feel disoriented in the new competitive society, even though they wouldn't want the wall back. In polls, majorities in places like Russia or Ukraine have said ordinary people didn't benefit as much as elites from the post-communist changes, and older Russians especially regret the USSR's end. Over 70% of Russian seniors called it a misfortune. Meanwhile, younger people predominantly see the change positively and are more globally minded. This generational difference in perspective is part of the legacy the region navigates. how to honor and learn from the past without being trapped by it, and how different age cohorts understand their identity and history. Memory of the Cold War divisions is also institutionalized in museums, school curricula, and commemorations. As mentioned earlier, memorials to the victims of communism were built, e.g., a striking monument in Prague shows a series of bronze figures gradually disintegrating, symbolizing political prisoners whose bodies and souls were broken. These memorials and annual observances, some countries mark a day for communist victims, serve to educate youth about what their parents endured, yet time moves on. By 2025, a young adult in, say, Hungary has no personal memory of Soviet troops in their street, and for them the pressing issues are contemporary: jobs, climate, etc., ensuring that the lessons of division, like the importance of democracy and openness, endure in collective memory, is an ongoing effort. The end of Yalta, Cherniaev wrote about in 1989, signified that Europe no longer accepted being carved up, and that notion is passed down so that new generations hopefully cherish unity and freedom. Another aspect of identity post-1989 is how people in East and West viewed each other after mixing. There were mutual surprises. Westerners visiting Eastern Europe found modern, educated societies dispelling some Cold War-era stereotypes that everything across the curtain was gray and dreary. Easterners going west discovered that not all was perfect in capitalist lands, e.g., seeing homelessness or inequality in Western cities might have been eye-opening given communist propaganda had both exaggerated and concealed different issues. These experiences refined identities. One realized that everyone was just human and European beneath the propaganda. Over time, many families became trans-European. Marriages across former East-West lines became common. For example, a Czech might marry a Frenchman she met during studies, or a Lithuanian and a Swede might start a family after meeting on a work project. These ties reinforced a European identity that transcended the old divisions. Still, national identities did not disappear. In fact, they often resurged proudly after communism. Freed from forced internationalism under Soviet hegemony, people embraced national symbols. But gradually, nationalism mellowed as EU integration took root. With some exceptions, there are nationalist currents in some countries as a reaction to globalization. Identity in the region today can be multi-layered. One can feel Romanian and European, or Slovak and a proud Central European, etc. The Cold War's abrupt East-West binary has given way to a spectrum of identities and alignments. One cannot ignore the effect of language and culture mixing on identity. English's rise as a lingua franca means a Polish youth and a Spanish youth can communicate directly now. This fosters a pan-European youth culture to an extent. Pop music, fashion, internet memes are quite shared. However, languages like Russian, once the common second language in Eastern Bloc, receded in influence outside former USSR. Many Eastern European young folks stopped learning Russian and switched to Western languages, symbolizing an identity reorientation away from Moscow's orbit towards broader Europe. Finally, consider the image of people literally crossing the physical remnants of division. After 1989, border fences were removed in many places. The militarized Iron Curtain along the Austrian-Hungarian border became a park and biking trail. Train routes that had been cut were reconnected. Berlin, divided by concrete for 28 years, reunited. Families and friends met at the wall's remains to celebrate, and soon that line was erased by new urban development. These physical reunions were deeply emotional. The older generation, who remembered a united Europe before Wetun, felt a circle was closed. Younger ones saw it as a new chance to define themselves in a continent finally at peace. In a calm storytelling manner, one could recount perhaps the story of an East German father and West German mother who had been separated and only could meet occasionally at Checkpoint Charlie, now finally raising their children together without constraints, or a Polish grandmother whose son emigrated in the 1980s Solidarity crackdown, now able to visit him in Chicago and have him come home freely with grandchildren she hadn't met except by letters. Such family reunions were countless and are part of the healing of Europe's divided psyche. Now, as we approach the conclusion of our narrative journey, we should reflect on how, more than 3 decades since the wall fell, Europe has integrated both physically and psychologically, but also acknowledge what challenges or divisions might persist and how memory of the Cold War is preserved or fading. The final portion will likely contemplate integration, memory, and generational change explicitly, summing up what Europe's post-communist transformation means today, how far integration has come, how societies remember the past, or sometimes choose to forget aspects of it, and how the generation that lived through 1989 passes the baton to those who didn't, ensuring the lessons and hopes endure. Let's proceed to wrap up with those reflections in a serene and thoughtful tone, tying together the threads of politics, culture, and human stories we've traced through Europe's journey after the fall of the Berlin Wall.